A bowl holds water perfectly, but a bowl made to someone else's measure can never hold what is yours. It will carry what they intended, serve the purpose they imagined, and you will spend years pouring yourself into it, wondering why nothing stays warm. Tonight is for that. Not the dramatic version, the quiet one, the one that happens so slowly you barely notice. The person who woke up one day inside someone else's idea of a good life, wearing it the way you wear a coat that almost fits. It keeps you warm enough that you forget, for long stretches, it was not made for you. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from this. Not tiredness of the body, though the body carries it too. In the shoulders, in the jaw, in the place behind the sternum, where something has been braced longer than you can remember. It is the exhaustion of continuous translation, of taking what is actually true in you and rendering it into a language someone else will accept, of editing, perpetually, the first draft of yourself. If any part of that is familiar tonight, you are in the right place. Where are you listening from tonight? I am curious about the rooms and dark windows behind which someone right now is holding this same question. I want to say something before we begin. I did not choose these stories because I have resolved this question. I chose them because I have sat with it long enough to recognize its particular texture. There was a stretch of years when I spent a great deal of energy being someone other people understood. It was during that time that I first read about Bankei Yotaku, the 17th-century Japanese Zen master, who, at 11 years old, built himself a small hut in the hills to sit alone with a Confucian phrase, because someone had told him that was where virtue lived. I have thought about that boy many times since. He did not know yet that the thing he was looking for was not in the text. It was the thing doing the looking. Tonight, I will bring you 10 lives from across the Buddhist and Zen world, from a monastery in 17th-century Japan to the cave retreats of 11th-century Tibet, from the earliest recorded voices of women in Buddhist India to a forest hillside in 20th-century Thailand. Each of these lives touch tonight's question from a different angle, in a different century, in different words. These stories are contemplative in nature and are not a substitute for medical or therapeutic care. Find whatever position your body has chosen. Let the weight of your shoulders release, not corrected, simply released, the way snow falls from a branch when it has been there long enough. No decision, only the moment when holding becomes unnecessary. The bowl was never the point. What the bowl holds has always been yours. The bells of the lower temple had not rung yet, but the crows knew the hour. Their calls moved across the valley in the grey before light, each one landing and dissolving into the mist that lay between the pine-covered ridges, like something that had not yet decided whether to be cloud or water. The courtyard stones held the particular cold of a night that had never quite warmed, dark with damp. Each one fitted against the next with the imprecision of human hands working by memory. The air carried pine, resin, and cold ash, and underneath both, faint and persistent, the smell of ink that had been ground so many mornings in the same room that it had entered the walls. The boy was 11 years old, and he had been sitting at his desk since before the crows. His name was Bankei, and he had been given a text to copy. This was not unusual. Every student in the village school copied the same texts, the same classical characters, the same phrases that their fathers and their fathers' fathers had copied before them. The teacher moved between the desks each morning with a patience that had long since become indistinguishable from indifference. pausing here to correct a stroke, there to tilt a brush in a smaller hand. Bankei copied what he was given. He was not a difficult student. He was not a slow one. But there was a phrase. It appeared near the opening of the Great Learning, one of the foundational texts of Confucian education, the kind of text so embedded in the culture that its phrases appeared on temple gates and government buildings, and the lips of men who had forgotten they were quoting anything at all. The phrase was this bright virtue, Mingde in Chinese, Meitoku in Japanese. The Great Learning said that the foundation of all self-cultivation, the root of every good act and ordered life, was the illumination of this bright virtue within oneself. Bankei copied the phrase. He copied it again. He turned it in his mind the way a child turns a stone found in a river, looking for the side that explains the stone. What was it? Where was it? The teacher, when Bankei asked, explained that bright virtue was the innate goodness of human nature, the fundamental moral capacity with which every person was born. Bankei wrote this down. He thought about it for 3 days. At the end of 3 days, he had the same question he had started with, only it had grown heavier. He asked his older brother. His older brother told him not to be ridiculous. He asked a monk at the local temple, who smiled the smile of a man who has been asked questions he cannot answer and has learned to make that smile look like wisdom. He went back to the text. The text said the same thing it had always said. The planted question had taken root inside him now. The way certain seeds work, invisible for months, until one morning the earth simply opens and something is there that was not there before. Except this seed seemed to produce nothing but more soil. Bright virtue. He knew the words. He did not know the thing. This was the year he stopped being easy to live with. His family was not unkind. His father had been a samurai who became a physician, a practical man of shifting circumstances, and the household ran with the particular efficiency of a family that had learned to adapt. Bankei's mother was patient with him, but patience has a texture, and after enough months, it becomes possible to feel the effort inside it. He asked questions at meals that silenced the table. He read when he was supposed to sleep. His younger siblings learned to give him a certain amount of room, the way you give room to a fire that has not decided how large it intends to become. By the time he was 16, he had left. Not dramatically. Not in the middle of the night with his belongings tied in cloth. He found a Rinzai Zen temple, an hour's walk from his village, presented himself to the master, Umpo Zenjo, and said, simply, that he needed to understand bright virtue and could not find it. Umpo was a small man, already old, with the unhurried quality of someone who has finished being in a hurry and found the view from the other side surprisingly pleasant. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the 16-year-old standing in his gate with the expression of someone reading a document in a language they recognize but have not studied for some years. Then he said, if you want to find it, stop looking for it in the words. The words are a finger. You have been eating the finger. Bankei did not understand this. He bowed. He began his training. The years that followed were the years Bankei would later speak of, with the careful neutrality of a person describing whether they survived. He sat in meditation for hours that became days that accumulated into years without the thing he was looking for appearing anywhere in the sitting. He read everything Umpo gave him, and everything he could find beyond what Umpo gave him. He sought out other teachers. He traveled to teachers who had the reputation of knowing something essential, and sat with them, and asked his question, in the careful, varied ways of a person who has learned that the same question asked differently sometimes produces different results. It did not produce different results. There was a teacher in Nagasaki who was known for cutting through confusion with a single exchange. Bankei walked 3 weeks to reach him, sleeping in temple guest houses, and once in an open field when the guest houses were full, arriving with his sandals worn through and his question unchanged. The teacher received him in a garden where 3 stones had been arranged in the raked gravel with a care that suggested someone had moved them many times before they stopped needing to be moved. The pine above cast a shadow that shifted almost imperceptibly as they sat. Bankei stated his question. The teacher looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You are asking the wrong question." Bankei asked what the right question was. The teacher said, "When you find out, you will know." It was not a question at all. Bankei walked the 3 weeks home, carrying this. He sat with it for months. He turned it in every direction. He arrived, eventually, at the conclusion that either the teacher had spoken something of such depth that he lacked the capacity to receive it, or the teacher did not know either and had found a beautiful way to say so. He was never entirely certain which. Both possibilities struck him, in different moments, as equally instructive. He had been given a life that was supposed to contain him, a path that was supposed to lead somewhere, a vocabulary that was supposed to name the thing he was looking for, and he was very good at all of it. He could copy the texts with a hand that other students admired. He could sit for longer than the older monks without shifting his weight. He could answer questions about doctrine correctly, give the right response to the right teaching, demonstrate with complete accuracy that he had absorbed what he had been given. But the bowl held everything except the thing it was supposed to hold. By the time he was 25, he was dying. This is not metaphor. The years of extreme practice had thinned him until the bones in his face were visible under the skin in a way they had not been before. He had sealed himself into a small hut and refused to emerge, sitting until his legs lost sensation, eating when he remembered, allowing his body to become secondary to the search in the way that seems necessary until the body begins, with increasing urgency, to disagree. He was coughing blood. The room smelled of it. A specific smell, iron and salt, that he had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the smell of a room you have lived in for too long. One morning in that sealed room, very early, while the first birds were beginning their noise in the pine trees outside, Bankei raised himself from his sitting position. He had been awake since before the birds. He had been coughing since before that. He leaned toward the wall. He cleared his throat. A small amount of blood-threaded mucus hit the wall near a crack in the plaster, and he watched it slide slowly downward. He was so tired he had stopped being tired. He had gone through tired into something beyond it, some territory that has no good name in any language, where the body is simply executing its remaining functions without the person's participation. He sat back. Outside, a bush warbler called once, clear, particular, with the specific unhurried quality of a bird that has no opinion about whether anyone is listening. He had been searching for the light inside the lamp by asking the lamp to describe itself. He understood this now in the way you understand something that has always been true but that requires a specific moment of exhaustion to become visible. The bright virtue he had chased through 14 years of texts and teachers and practice had never been absent. It was the thing that had been looking. It was the capacity inside him that heard the bird, the knowing that recognized sound as sound, the awareness that had been present before the first character was copied and would be present after the last one. He had been trying to capture it the way you try to catch your own hand. He opened the door of the hut. The morning was cold and specific. The light was the color of water before it decides to be blue. The pine needles held their particular arrangement. He stood in the doorway for a long time, not meditating, not seeking, not translating what he saw into the vocabulary of what he was supposed to be finding. Just standing, just the cold, just the bird, which had not stopped simply because he had understood something. He was sick for another year before his body caught up to what had shifted. During that year, he was cared for by a woman in a nearby village named Umeno, who brought him soup without discussing it and changed the cloth on his forehead without discussing it, and seemed, in her general manner, to have no opinion about whether he was a Zen monk experiencing a spiritual transformation or simply a young man who had driven himself into illness through stubbornness. This unconcerned kindness was, he said later, its own kind of teaching. When he recovered, he did not return to the monastery immediately. He walked the roads between villages and temple towns of Japan, often with no particular destination, sleeping in rough lodgings or not sleeping, spending time with the ordinary people he met the way someone spends time with the sea, not trying to extract anything from it, simply being near it and finding that something transferred anyway. He would become, in time, the teacher that ordinary people came to, not the aristocrats, not the scholars, the farmers and the merchants and the women who had no formal status in the religious hierarchy and who were told, in various ways, that the gates of enlightenment were for other people. Bankei found this peculiar. He would stand up in front of hundreds of people, sometimes thousands, and say simply, everyone here was born with the Buddha mind, the unborn mind. It was there before any word for it existed. It is there now. You do not need to earn it, or locate it, or describe it correctly. You simply need to stop performing someone else's idea of what a person with it looks like. His students reported that people would arrive at his talks carrying elaborate notebooks, prepared to write down the deep teachings. And he would look at them, all those people with their ink and their empty pages, and say, "Close the notebooks. What you came here to find is the thing that has been reading the notebooks. You cannot write it down, but you knew that before you came. That is why you came." He taught for nearly 50 years, in plain Japanese, refusing the aristocratic language of formal Zen instruction, refusing the hierarchies that kept certain people out of certain doors. He said, more than once, the unborn Buddha mind does not ask where you came from. It does not ask whether you have studied the right texts. It does not prefer one vessel to another. It simply is. As it was before you had a name for it, as it will be when the name has been forgotten. He died in 1693, in the temple Ryomonji, in the room where he had taught for decades. The records say he died as he had lived in his later years without urgency. He had finished a short verse before sleeping, the way a person finishes a sentence before setting the brush down, not because the sentence was the point, but because it was the natural end of the movement that had begun it. A student found him the next morning. The room was very still. The student stood in the doorway for a long time, not certain what to say. There was nothing to say. The unborn mind, Bankei had always insisted, was not the thing that died. What died was the version of him that could be pointed to, described, argued with. What remained? What had always remained? What had been there before the first text was copied What had heard the warbler on that bloody morning in the sealed hut was exactly what it had always been. The bird outside did not sing for him. It simply sang, and he, for the first time, had heard it without needing it to mean something. That understanding did not leave the room with him. Let that land now, wherever in your body it wants to land. There is something you have been carrying that was given to you before you were old enough to choose whether you wanted it. A way of measuring yourself, or a version of yourself that was agreed upon by people who loved you and were doing their best, and who still got the measurements slightly wrong. Not because they were wrong people, because they were working from their own borrowed bowls. You have been very good at fitting yourself into those measurements. So good, perhaps, that you sometimes forget the fitting is happening. Bankei spent 14 years on that forgetting, and the thing that ended it was not a greater effort at remembering. It was a bird. It was the moment he had nothing left to give to the search, and so the search simply stopped, and in the silence where it had been, something that had never been absent quietly announced itself. Let the breath have this for a moment, not to carry it anywhere, just to hold it the way a bowl holds whatever you pour into it, without asking whether you poured the right thing. You do not have to explain yourself into existence. You were already here before the explanation began. Let the shoulders have this now. The weight there, whatever has been sitting in the shoulders since sometime today or yesterday or longer than that, it does not need to be carried further tonight. You do not have to locate bright virtue. You do not have to earn the right to be the person you already are. The thing you are looking for is the thing looking. If sleep comes to you here, that is exactly right. You do not need to stay awake for any of this. The understanding, if it is working beneath the level where sleep interrupts anything. Let the breath move in and out without your help. It knows how to do this. It has always known. And somewhere to the south, in the mountain monasteries of the Korean peninsula, during a period when the whole shape of the kingdom had just changed and being a monk had become, overnight, a dangerous thing to be. A young man was sitting over a text he had written himself, an argument, careful and intricate, defending the very life he had chosen against the people who had decided such a life had no place in the new order. He was very good at the argument. He was not yet certain the argument was the life. The last snow of the season came late that year to the mountains above the Goryeo capital, arriving in the second month, when the lower valleys had already begun to soften, and the plum trees along the southern walls had already committed to their blossoms. Up in the passes the snow came sideways, without apology, coating the eastern faces of the pine trunks and filling the spaces between the stones of the mountain paths with a white that was very clean and very cold, and that muffled the sound of everything except the wind. A candle burned in the window of the Academy's eastern study hall. The smell of pine smoke and tallow, the particular cold of a stone building that retains winter in its walls long after winter has left the air outside. Inside, a young man was bent over a text he had already read 17 times. His name was Kifwa, and he was 19 years old, and he was considered by his teachers to be the most capable student of his generation. This was not said with the warmth of affection. It was said the way certain things are said in institutions that value precision as an assessment, delivered with the sober appreciation one gives to a well-made instrument. The son of a diplomat, educated at the Goryeo Academy alongside the sons of the highest-ranking families. He had mastered the classical Chinese texts with a fluency that made his teachers occasionally uneasy. The way certain students make their teachers uneasy by understanding things too quickly and then waiting, with barely concealed patience, for the explanation to catch up. He was copying a passage from the 4 books. The brush moved across the paper with the confident unhurriedness of a hand that has performed this motion so many times it no longer requires supervision. The characters appeared in the precise, balanced style his calligraphy teacher had spent 4 years producing in him, each stroke landing where it was supposed to land, each character relating to its neighbors with the proper spatial dignity. But his friend Do-hyun had a cough that was not improving. This was the planted question, though Kiwa did not know it yet. Do-hyun had been coughing since the first cold month, the dry, persistent kind that wakes a person in the dark hours and does not apologize for doing so. The physicians had said different things. Do-hyun himself was unconcerned, or performed unconcern well enough that Kiwa could not locate the seam between the performance and the thing underneath. They had studied together since they were 12. They had argued about the texts late into countless evenings. Do-hyun always more willing to doubt what the texts said. Kiwa always more willing to trust that the doubt was a misreading rather than a discovery. Kiwa set down the brush. He looked at the character he had just completed. It was correct. It was exactly correct. Every proportion observed. Every stroke executed in the proper sequence. It looked the way virtue was supposed to look, rendered in ink on paper by someone who had been trained to render it correctly. He picked the brush up and continued. 3 weeks later, Do-hyun was dead. He died in the room they shared, in the early morning of a day that had not yet decided what kind of day it would be. Kiwa was there. He had been there through the night, sitting beside the low table where the lamp burned, listening to the breathing change in the way breathing changes when the body begins the work of stopping. He did not know what to do with his hands. He was 19 years old and had read more about the nature of human life than most people read in a lifetime, and he sat beside his friend with his hands in his lap, not knowing what to do with them. When the breathing stopped, the room became a different kind of room. He sat in it for a long time. The lamp continued to burn. Outside, the sky began to make the early adjustments that would become morning. He sat with the 4 books in his memory, all of it, every passage, the elegant architecture of a system of thought built over centuries by some of the most careful minds the world had produced, and he searched it for something to say to the room. Not something to say aloud, something to say to himself, inside the room, in the presence of his friend's body, in the specific silence that had replaced the specific sound of breathing. He could not find it. He knew what the text said about death. He knew the Confucian framing of grief, the proper rites, the structure within which loss was to be held so that it did not become disorder. He knew all of it with the completeness of someone who had been given these things as the vocabulary of his inner life before he was old enough to choose a different vocabulary. And none of it, not one phrase, not one carefully constructed sentence, could say what needed to be said in that room. He sat with the lamp until it burned out. Then he sat in the dark. He left the academy 2 months later. He did not leave in anger. He did not leave with a manifesto or an argument or a clear sense of where he was going. He left the way water leaves a vessel that has been tilted, simply following the direction that gravity and the shape of things made available. He had been trained to believe that the right structure, rigorously applied, would hold whatever needed to be held. He had sat in a room with the complete failure of that belief and had not been able to argue his way out of it. He went to the mountain monasteries. He went to the first one, still wearing the scholar's robes, which announced him to everyone he met before he opened his mouth. The monks received him with a courtesy that had the quality of people who have seen this before. The scholar, arriving at the monastery gate, with his learning worn visibly, like armor, he has not yet figured out he no longer needs. They gave him a room. They gave him instruction. They did not take his books away. He spent 3 years moving between the mountain monasteries of the Korean peninsula, studying the Buddhist texts with the same intensity he had brought to the Confucian ones. The monasteries were cold in a different way than the academy had been cold. The cold of high passes and stone floors that had absorbed centuries of early mornings. The cold of rooms where people had been waking before dawn for so long that the darkness itself seemed to have developed a particular quality, patient and without agenda. He carried his scholar's habits with him, the careful annotation, the comparison of sources, the construction of argument from evidence. But he also carried, in a part of himself he had not previously needed to consult, the memory of a room, a lamp burning out, and the complete failure of everything he knew. What he found in the Buddhist texts was not what he had expected. They did not say the Confucian texts were wrong. They said something more disorienting than that. They said the question of wrong and right was itself a kind of cage, and that there was something prior to that question, something that both systems were pointing toward from different sides of a mountain neither had quite managed to climb. He was eventually brought to the teacher Muhak. Muhak was the last man to hold the title of national teacher in the old Goryeo order, a title that would not be given again under the new Joseon dynasty that had just reorganized the entire shape of the world. Kiwa had grown up inside. He was old, and he had the quality of old teachers who have been waiting a long time for a particular student and have passed the time without impatience. The way certain trees wait for a season they know will come without checking each morning whether it has arrived yet. He received Kihwa in a room where a single scroll hung on the wall, and a bowl of cold water sat on the table, and the light came from one direction and did not apologize for leaving the rest of the room in shadow. Kiwa presented himself. He explained his background, his training, his reasons for leaving the academy, what he had been studying since, the questions he was working with. He was thorough and precise. He had spent 3 years developing a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between Seon practice and doctrinal study, and he explained this relationship clearly, because clarity was what he had been trained to offer, and he offered it well. When he had finished, Muhak was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You defend the door very well. Have you walked through it?" Kihwa did not answer immediately. The room held the silence without any apparent discomfort. He had written 10,000 words in defense of a silence he had not yet learned to enter. He understood this now. In the room, with the cold water in the bowl, and the single direction of light, and the old teacher who had not moved, and was not going to move until something in Kiwa moved first. He had brought the tools of the old life into the new one. He had been defending Buddhism using the language of the system he had left, which was precise and rigorous and capable of winning arguments, and which carried the fundamental limitation of any borrowed container. It could hold the shape of what he was trying to say, but it could not hold the temperature. He bowed. He asked Muhak to teach him. The years that followed were the years Kiwa would later describe, in the few personal passages that appear among his voluminous writings, as the years he learned to stop arguing with the door and simply open it. He sat in meditation in the mountain monasteries of the new Joseon kingdom, a kingdom that had decided Buddhism was a remnant of a corrupted past, and that Confucian order was the only legitimate framework for a life well lived. He sat in this political weather without entirely ignoring it. He was not the kind of man who could ignore the weather, but he sat in it without being entirely shaped by it either. He wrote a great deal. He wrote the commentaries that scholars would later call among the finest prose produced by the Korean Seon tradition. He wrote the essays in which he argued, with scrupulous care, that Buddhism and Confucianism were not opponents but expressions of the same deeper recognition, approached from different angles, with different tools, in different centuries. And he wrote these arguments in the language of the Confucian scholars who were attacking him, using their texts, their logical structures, their terms of praise and condemnation, because he was the best person available for this particular work, and the work needed doing. But he knew, and this is what his later writings suggest, in the oblique way certain kinds of knowledge can only be suggested. He knew that the argument was not the life. The argument was a bridge. The bridge was useful. The bridge was not the other shore. Near the end of his life, he retired to the southern tip of Gangwado, an island where the water came in from the west, with the consistent indifference of water that has no opinion about the affairs of kingdoms. He taught there until his death in 1433. The students who came to him in those final years reported that he had stopped making arguments, not because the arguments had been wrong, because he had finally stopped needing the other shore to be persuaded. There is a record of a conversation from those last years between Kiwa and a young monk who had come specifically to hear the famous arguments, the intellectual defenses of the Buddhist path that had made Kiwa's reputation. The young monk asked about the relationship between the two teachings. Kiwa looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Put the texts down." "What do you hear?" The young monk listened. He said, "The wind, the sea." Kiwa said those were here before the argument. They will be here after it. Begin there. The argument was perfect. The argument was not the life. Let that rest where it lands. There is something you know very well how to explain, a version of yourself that you have become good at accounting for, good at defending in the language of the people whose opinions have mattered to you. Perhaps you have even come to believe the explanation is the thing itself. Perhaps the explanation has served you well enough for long enough that the seam between it and what actually lives inside you has become difficult to locate. Kiwa spent most of his adult life being useful with borrowed tools. And there is nothing wrong with borrowed tools. A borrowed bowl holds water. A borrowed vocabulary can defend something true. The question is only whether you have mistaken the tool for the life, the defense for the living, the argument for the door. You have been listening through a long night already, and something in you is beginning to release what it holds most tightly. You may feel this as a slight loosening somewhere in the chest, or you may not feel it as anything at all, because sometimes the releasing happens below the level of feeling, the way ice releases its shape into water without announcing the moment of transition. Think of a moment. Perhaps you have had this moment at a dinner table, in a meeting, in a conversation where you were performing the version of yourself that the situation required, when you noticed, briefly, a small gap between what you were saying and what was actually true. The gap may have closed very quickly. You may have continued the conversation without anyone noticing anything had passed across your face. But the gap was there. That gap is not a failure. That gap is the beginning. You do not have to earn the right to the thing behind the door by defending it correctly. You already know the words for what you need. The words are not the thing, but you knew that. That is why tonight, the words are not enough, and that is exactly right. Let the breath be the door, just for now, in and out. The wind and the sea, which were here before the argument, and will be here long after. You do not have to go anywhere for this. You are already at the shore. Let the jaw be soft now. The jaw holds more than we ask it to hold. Let whatever it is been carrying there simply sit in something larger than the jaw. If sleep finds you here, you do not need to resist it. The question behind the question does not require you to be awake to continue working on it. It knows what it is doing. And far to the west, and much further back in time, in a country where the monsoon rains had already ended and the ground had that particular smell of wet earth cooling after long heat, a woman was walking away from a mirror for what she had just decided would be the last time. The rains had ended 3 days before, and the city of Vaisali was doing what cities do after long confinement, releasing itself into the streets with the slightly excessive energy of something that has been held too long in one place. The air smelled of wet earth cooling, and of the marigold garlands that the flower sellers had brought out in quantities calibrated to the festival mood. Their orange and yellow in the low afternoon light, so vivid they seemed to be producing their own illumination. The sound of water still running in the drainage channels along the main road, carrying the last of the season's accumulation toward the river. And underneath all of it, the smell of sandalwood smoke from the household shrines, sweet and slightly resinous, drifting from the open doorways of the merchant houses along the street where the most important people in the city tended to live. Vimala's house was on this street. This was not an accident. Nothing about Vimala's life was an accident, or had been for a long time. She was perhaps 25. Records from this era are not precise about such things, and Vimala herself did not think in terms of years, which she had always found an imprecise way to measure a life, and she was, by any measure, available to the city of Vaisali in the 5th century before the Common Era. A success. The house had 3 courtyards. The outer courtyard held the jasmine that her clients always remarked upon. The inner courtyard held the pool that reflected the sky at a particular angle in the late afternoon that she had calculated, when choosing this house, would produce exactly the effect it produced. The innermost room had been arranged with the patience and precision of someone who understands that the environment in which people encounter you shapes what they think they are encountering. She had been arranging environments since she was 16. She was a courtesan, and in the world she inhabited, this was a specific and socially legible role, one that carried its own disciplines and its own hierarchies and its own measures of excellence. She had excelled. She had learned the arts that her profession required, the music, the conversation, the management of a room's mood, the way a musician manages a melody, guiding it without appearing to guide it. She had learned to read what a person wanted to be seen as, and then to see them that way, which was, she had discovered early, the most powerful thing one person could offer another. Most people were so hungry to be seen as they wished to be seen that they confused the offering of this with something much larger. She was very skilled. She was also very tired, though she had not named the tiredness yet. The way you do not name a smell that has been present so long, you have stopped registering it as separate from the air. The planted question arrived on an ordinary afternoon. She was crossing the outer courtyard when she saw, through the gate, a group of monks and nuns making their way along the street in the slow, deliberate manner of people who have decided that the pace of the city is not their pace and have declined to negotiate. They were collecting alms in the manner of the followers of the ascetic Gautama, whose teachings had been spreading through the Gangetic plain for some decades now. and whom Vimala had heard about without finding particularly relevant to her life. She was about to turn back toward the inner courtyard when she noticed one of the nuns. The nun was perhaps 40, which in this context meant she had been practicing for many years. She had the particular quality of certain people who have spent a great deal of time alone with themselves and have, through that time, arrived at a specific kind of ease, not the ease of someone who does not feel things, but the ease of someone who feels things without being overturned by them. She was not looking at Vimala's house with disapproval. She was not looking at it with judgment or with curiosity or with any of the expressions Vimala was practiced at reading and responding to. She was simply looking at it the way you look at something that is there. And then her gaze moved to Vimala, and she looked at Vimala the same way. Vimala had been looked at by more people than she could count. She had been looked at with desire and with envy, and with the particular covetous appreciation that men brought to things they wished to possess. She had been looked at with contempt and with calculation, and with the specific male nervousness of people who are not sure whether they are allowed to want what they want. She had learned to read every variety of this looking and to respond to each one with the precision of a practitioner who has studied the instrument for years. She had never been looked at the way this woman was looking at her. Not through her, not past her, not at the version she was presenting, at something behind the presentation, and without particular surprise at finding it there, and without any expression that suggested the finder intended to do anything with what she had found. Vimala did something she had not done in years. She tried to perform for someone and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the performance was not landing. Not because the performance was imperfect, because the audience was not in the place where performances land. She walked to the gate. She said, in the tone she used when she wished to establish the terms of an encounter, "You are one of the followers of the ascetic." The nun looked at her without hurry. Then she said, "I see you. Not the version you are showing me. The one behind it, who is very tired." Vimala had no response to this. This was unusual. The nun did not press the advantage. She did not elaborate. She simply stood in the afternoon light with the jasmine smell coming through the gate between them and waited with the patience of someone for whom waiting was not meaningfully different from anything else. What happened next? Vimala described later in the verses she composed after her ordination, in the compressed and luminous language of the Therigatha. She said, "I removed my ornaments. I dismissed my attendants. I followed her." The prose record does not say this. The prose record from this period is not particularly interested in the interior lives of courtesans, but the verses, which were composed by Vimala herself and preserved through centuries of oral transmission by women who found them worth preserving, say something more specific. They say that Vimala had spent her whole life being seen, and had organized the entirety of her existence around the skill of being seen in precisely the right way, and that when she stood at the gate and felt the nun's gaze move through the performance and locate what was behind it, she understood for the first time that she had not once, in all those years, asked whether she had been present for any of it. The ornaments were not a small thing. This needs to be understood. They were not decoration. They were the instrument. The specific arrangement of gold and stone and silk that she wore when receiving clients was as carefully calibrated as the courtyards, as the pool, as the jasmine. It was part of the system by which Vimala made herself into the thing that the situation required. She had put them on and taken them off so many times, and always for someone else. Always as part of a movement in a larger performance, that the motion had become as automatic as breathing. She stood at the gate and began to take them off. She had spent her life being seen. She had never once asked whether she had been present for any of it. Her hand reached the last bracelet, a gold one, plain, worn on the left wrist since she was 17, given to her by the woman who had trained her in this profession and who had said, the morning Vimala first wore it, that it would remind her always of the value of what she offered. She had worn it every day since. She had taken it off and put it back on without thinking about it, without thinking about the woman who gave it to her, without thinking about the 17-year-old who had accepted it with both hands and looked at it for a long time before looking up. Her hand stayed on the bracelet. She did not remember the last time she had done anything that no one was watching. She took it off. The ornaments fell, and the woman who had worn them remained, which was the part she had not planned for. She followed the nun that afternoon and received instruction, and the instruction was not what she had expected. It was not, as she had half anticipated, a series of condemnations of the life she had lived. The nun taught her about the mind that constructs its own cage from the very materials it has been given as gifts, about the way a person can become so skilled at presenting themselves that they lose the thread back to whatever was present before the skill, about the practice of simply sitting, without performing the sitting, without arranging the sitting into something that anyone, including oneself, would recognize as admirable. What Vimala found in that first instruction, and in the months of practice that followed it, was not peace in the sense she had imagined peace. It was something more specific and more strange. It was the experience of being in a room without arranging the room, of sitting in her own company without preparing that company for observation. She had lived inside other people's perceptions of her for so long that her own inner life had developed the habit of also watching her, also assessing, also asking whether the current version was the right version. The practice she was being taught asked her to notice this watching and simply not continue it, not suppress it, not condemn it. Simply see it as the habit it was, the way you see a door you have been walking through for years, and finally notice, one morning, that it was always open. This was not comfortable. It was more honest than comfort. She sat in the early mornings in the community of women practitioners, the sky outside, still the deep blue of genuine darkness, the floor cold through her robe in a way that asked for nothing and offered nothing and was simply cold. The way floors are cold when they are being floors and nothing else. She smelled the damp of the night still in the walls, and the faint sweetness of the oil lamp that had burned down in the night, and the particular smell of a group of people who have been sitting in the same room since before dawn. Warm breath and worn cloth, and something underneath both that is harder to name. The smell perhaps of concentration, of people who are not performing anything for one another. She sat in this room and she watched her mind arrange and rearrange itself, perform and reperform, adjust and readjust. And each time she noticed this, she did not judge it. She simply noticed it. And in the noticing, there was something that had not been available to her before, something quiet and without opinion. Something that watched the performance without being taken in by it. She had not known this was in her. It had been in her the entire time. Vimala was ordained and practiced for years and became, the texts say, an arahant, one who has seen through the construction all the way to what was there before it. She composed her verses in the luminous compressed form of the Therigatha, which are among the oldest surviving words written by a woman in any tradition. In those verses, she does not condemn her former life. She does not perform remorse. She describes it with the clear-eyed specificity of someone who has finally been able to look at a room from the outside and see it for what it was. A room, finely made, and not her. The verses end with a single image, all ties. She says, "Human and divine have been cut, not severed in anger, not broken in grief. Cut the way you cut, something you have been holding so long, your hand has forgotten it is not your hand. Let that settle now wherever in you it wants to settle. There is a way you have learned to appear, not falsely. This is not about falseness. It may be entirely genuine, this version of you that other people recognize. But there is a difference between the version that has been shaped by what others needed to see and the one that was there before any of that shaping began. Think of the particular adjustment you make, the small one, almost unconscious, when someone you want to impress walks into a room. The way the shoulders draw back a little, the way the voice finds a different register. You may not even notice it happening. It has become as natural as breathing. Vimala's ornaments were hers. Everyone has their version. The adjustment is not the problem. The habit of not noticing the adjustment, that is where the borrowed life begins. You may be wearing something like this right now. The careful arrangement, the posture that says what you need it to say, even in the dark, even alone, even at this hour. Some part of you may still be oriented toward a gaze that is not in the room. You do not have to perform this for anyone tonight. Whatever you are showing, the dark, you can set it down. The dark is not watching. Let the face be soft now. The face holds more expression than we realize, even when no one is looking. Let it release whatever shape it has been keeping. Not forced, not corrected, simply allowed to find the shape it finds when no one is asking anything of it. Not the version you are showing, the one behind it. That one has always been here. The breath knows this. Let the breath remind you. If sleep is close, let it be close. You do not need to finish this thought before sleeping. The thought has been finishing itself for longer than tonight. Let the weight of the hands settle wherever they have fallen. The hands have been doing things all day, holding and releasing and doing the work of hands in a world that requires a great deal of work. Let them simply rest now. No task, no arrangement, just the weight of them, which is their own. And much later, and far to the northwest, where the high passes of a young mountain range were just beginning to accumulate the first permanent snow that would define them for 1,000 years, a man was about to learn that the revenge he had finally succeeded in taking had left him in a room with himself that he did not know how to leave. The pass above Mangyul opened to the north like a wound that had never quite healed, a gap between two ridgelines where the wind came through without interruption from whatever lay beyond the horizon in that direction, which in this part of the world meant a very great deal of cold traveling, a very great distance before it found anything to stop against. Snow had gathered in the crease of the pass in the particular way that snow gathers in high places, not in drifts shaped by wind, but in the dense, ancient accumulations of many winters compressing one upon another until the snow at the bottom was no longer quite snow, but something harder and more patient. The sound of the wind in the pass was the sound of something that has been moving for so long it no longer remembers why it started. Below, the valley was lost in the particular grey that high-altitude cloud cover produces in the middle hours of afternoon. A grey that is not threatening but simply present, the way certain kinds of grief are present, not sharp, just there. Milarepa was sitting in the ruins of what had been his family's house. He was not a young man anymore, though he was not yet old. He was whatever a person becomes when they have spent years doing something they were told they must do and have now finished it. The roof of the house was partly gone, which it had been even before he added to its difficulties, and the light came in at an angle that made the interior look like something remembered rather than something present. The smell of old ash, the particular cold of a stone floor that had not held a fire in a long time. Outside, the sound of the wind in the pass, which did not change whether anyone was listening. He had done what his mother had sent him to do. This needs to be understood from the inside, not the outside. From the outside, it was a catastrophe. More than 30 people dead. The village his uncle had built brought down. A set of events that would follow Milarepa in the form of karma for the rest of his life, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. From the inside, in this specific moment, sitting in the ruins with the wind coming through the hole in the roof, it was something else. It was completion. A task that had been given to him when he was young enough that the task and his identity had become the same thing had now been finished. He had been the son who would avenge his family. He had been the student who would learn the necessary power. He had been the instrument through which his mother's grief would find its resolution. The instrument had nowhere left to point. This was the planted question Milarepa sat with in the ruins of his family's house, and it was not the question he had expected to be sitting with. He had expected, perhaps, relief. He had expected, perhaps, horror at what he had done. He found neither. He found instead a silence where a self had been. The specific silence that appears when a role you have been playing for so long it felt like your own face is finally, for the first time, removed. He did not know what was underneath. He was not certain there was anything underneath. He sat in the ruins until the light changed and the cold became specific rather than ambient. The cold that arrives when the sun has moved behind the western ridge and the air understands that the day's warmth was temporary and has decided to stop pretending otherwise. He sat in it without moving for a long time. Outside, the wind in the pass continued with the indifference of something that has no opinion about what happens below it. The ash smell in the room, the specific weight of stones that had been walls and were now a different arrangement of stones. He looked at his hands, which had done what they had done, and found in them no information that was useful to him. He had been, his whole life, the next thing the situation required. The bereaved child, the determined student, the instrument of justice. These were not false identities. He had inhabited them fully, had given them everything. But they had been assigned before he was old enough to assign himself anything, and he had been so busy fulfilling them that he had never noticed the question they were preventing him from asking. What was left when there was nothing left to fulfill? He left the ruins in the early dark and walked south without knowing where south would take him. He did not know where he was going. This was unusual. He had always known where he was going because someone had always told him. His father's death had told him he was the child who would survive. His uncle's theft had told him he was the dispossessed heir who would reclaim. His mother's demand had told him he was the instrument of justice. These were not gentle identities, but they were complete ones. They filled the shape of a person the way water fills a vessel. They left no empty space where you might notice the shape of the container itself. He walked south and then west, and eventually found himself before a teacher named Rong Tong, who received him with the generosity of someone who had seen this type of arrival before. The person who has completed everything they were assigned and arrived at the spiritual life, not through devotion but through the bun sitting, elimination of all other options. Rongtong gave him teachings. Milarepa received them with the diligence of someone who has learned that receiving what is given is a survival skill. But something did not move. He sat with the teachings the way he had sat with the Confucian texts. No, that was a different man, a different century. He sat with them the way you sit with a map when you do not know what country you are in. The map might be accurate. It was not for here. It was a different teacher, a man named Marpa, who told him the truth. Marpa was a translator and a practitioner, and a man of considerable personal difficulty, demanding, unpredictable, with the testing temperament of someone who has learned that what a student says they want and what a student needs to receive are rarely the same thing. He set Milarepa to work, not to meditate, not to study, to build a tower, then to tear it down and build it again, then to tear that one down. Then again, the work was not symbolic, or not only symbolic. The stones were real, the weight was real, the years were real. Years of carrying stones up a mountainside and setting them in place with a care that Marpa assessed each time with the impersonal eye of a man who has very specific standards and is comfortable with disappointment. Milarepa's back acquired injuries that would stay with him the rest of his life. His hands became the hands of a man who has been working stone for years, rather than the hands of a man who learned sorcery. He was not permitted to receive the deep teachings he had come for. He was not given a reason for any of this. He raged. He despaired. He tried, more than once, to go elsewhere, to find a teacher who would give him what he needed without requiring that he be unmade first. He nearly succeeded on at least 2 occasions that the records note. What brought him back each time was harder to name than that. A quality in Marpa's refusals that did not feel like cruelty. Exactly. Though it was not unlike cruelty. It felt like precision. The kind of precision a craftsman applies to a material they understand well, knowing exactly how much pressure is required to reshape it without breaking it. Milarepa had been working stone long enough now to understand this distinction from the stone side. The tower he was building stood on the eastern slope above Marpa's house, and when the light hit it at a certain angle in the late afternoon, the same low amber light that comes to high Tibetan valleys in the season, when the sky is very clear and very cold and the air has that quality of glass, it cast a shadow that fell across the path. Milarepa walked each evening from the site to the main buildings. He noticed this shadow every evening. He did not know whether Marpa had intended it. He suspected that Marpa had intended everything, which was both reassuring and deeply uncomfortable. The stones were not small. He carried them on his back, up the slope, each one chosen by Marpa from the riverbed with standards that Milarepa had stopped trying to anticipate. The back that had once belonged to a sorcerer's student now belonged to someone who had spent years learning what stone weighs when you are the one carrying it. Some evenings he could not straighten fully. He slept on his side. He had stopped, somewhere in the middle of the 2nd year. Thinking of this as punishment, he had not quite arrived at thinking of it as teaching. He existed, for a long time, in the space between those two understandings, which turned out to be a useful space to exist in. It had the quality of a room where you cannot see the walls yet, but can feel that the room is larger than you thought. Marpa's wife, Dakmema, occasionally brought him food when Marpa was not present. She did this without commentary, setting the bowl down near where he was working and retreating without requiring anything from him, not gratitude. not conversation, not the performance of a specific kind of humility. She was simply a woman who could see that someone was hungry and had something to give. Milarepa, who had grown up understanding generosity as part of an economy of obligation, sat with this unconditioned kindness and found it very difficult to receive. This too, he understood later, was part of the work. He raged. He despaired. He tried to go elsewhere. He came back. After many years, after the towers and the carrying and the back that would never be entirely right again. Marpa sat with him. He said, "I did not make you suffer because I hated you. I made you suffer because you were still carrying the life they gave you. You needed to put it down before you could pick up your own." He had spent his whole life being someone's instrument. The revenge was complete. The instrument had nowhere left to point. Milarepa received the teachings at last, and went into the mountains, and meditated in caves, in conditions that the body does not readily accommodate without complaint. He wore a single white cotton robe in the high passes, not because he was indifferent to cold, but because he had, through years of practice, developed a relationship with his own body's heat that made the robe sufficient. And because there was something he found clarifying about the simplicity of a single garment between himself and the mountain air. The cave at Lapchi was small enough that he could touch both walls without fully extending his arms. The floor was bare stone that had been bare stone for longer than any record could reach. The light came from one direction in the morning and from the opposite direction in the evening, and was absent entirely in the long nights, which were not frightening, but were very clear. Clear in the way that certain experiences are clear, when everything that usually fills them has been removed. He sang, "This is what the records emphasize, and it is the detail that makes him most distinctly himself as a historical figure, not the caves, not the Tumo practice, not the enlightenment that the tradition assigns him, but the songs. He composed them spontaneously, in the high passes, alone or with the occasional student who climbed to find him, and they were not in the careful formal language of doctrinal instruction. They were the songs of a man who had finally, after everything, found something that was his own to say. The 100,000 Songs of Milarepa. The name is not quite literal, but the spirit is accurate. Remain one of the great bodies of spontaneous religious poetry in any tradition, not because they are perfect, but because they are his. In the cave, the wind came through the same crack every night, and he stopped trying to block it, and it became, simply, the sound the mountain made when it breathed. He died in the mountains, having taught through song and example, and the sheer continued fact of his presence in conditions that argued against it. The Kagyu lineage he left behind carries his mark, the way a bowl carries the mark of the hands that shaped it. Not borrowed hands, his own. Let that open somewhere in you now, gently, without force. You have been given roles. All of us have. Some were given with love, and some with need, and some because the people who gave them had no other way to make sense of the world except to assign everyone a function within it. You received them when you were young enough that the role and your identity braided themselves together, and for a long time, perhaps a very long time, you could not find the place where one ended and the other began. The role is not wrong. The instrument is not wrong. But the instrument was never the player. There may be something you have been completing for someone else, not because you were forced to, but because the assignment was given before you were old enough to choose, and you have been good at it. And goodness at a borrowed task can look very much like a life. You did not choose everything that shaped you, but you are not required to keep carrying the shape they made. Let the chest open now, if it is willing, not pushed, not corrected. Just the small permission to be a little larger than the day required you to be. The wind in the cave became the sound the mountain made when it breathed. You do not have to block anything tonight. Let whatever comes through the crack simply be what it is, the night air, the sounds of wherever you are, the small particular noises of a world that is not asking anything of you right now. You can set the instrument down, just for tonight, just for this breath, and the next one, and whatever comes after that without your management. If sleep is moving through you, let it move. The understanding does not require you to be awake for its final portion. It has been working on you since long before tonight. Let the legs be heavy now. Let them remember they do not have to go anywhere. The weight of them, the simple fact of them resting against whatever holds them, that is enough. That is entirely enough. And much further east, in a direction that would have taken a traveler many weeks to reach, even in the most forgiving season, a woman had just decided that the life she had been given in childhood was not a life she could continue to refuse. The rains had been coming in from the Gulf for 3 days, and the market town of Ratchaburi smelled the way river towns smell when the water rises. Wet wood and mud, and the particular sweetness of fruit that has been sitting in humid air a day longer than it should, and underneath all of it, the brown river smell that does not go away in the rainy season because the river does not go away. The wooden shophouses along the main street had their shutters half closed against the weather, their eaves dripping in the steady way of structures that have been dripped from so many seasons they have stopped noticing. The tiles of the roofs held standing water in their concave centers until it overflowed in a continuous small cascade from eave to eave, so that walking the street under the eaves gave the sensation of walking behind a very long, very patient waterfall. The sound of rain on tile, the sound of the market vendors who had stayed despite the weather, calling out in the specific abbreviated language of people who have been saying the same things for so long they no longer need complete sentences, the smell of chili paste from someone's kitchen, and below it all, the sound of the river itself, running fast and brown at the edge of town. A low, persistent sound, like a conversation happening in another room that you cannot quite make out. Inside the family's shop, a girl of 6 was watching her mother. Her name was Ki, and what she was watching was not the kind of thing that was meant to be watched. Her mother was in the back room, in the difficulty that accompanies the arrival of a new child into the world, and the sounds coming from that room were the sounds of a body working at the very edge of what a body can be asked to do. The women who had come to help moved between the front room and the back, with the purposeful quiet of people who know what is needed and are providing it without commentary. The girl watched from the doorway. What she saw, or what she understood from what she saw, in the way that certain things are understood in the body before they reach the mind, was not what the adults in the room were focused on. They were focused on what was arriving. She was focused on what it cost. She ran away for 3 days. When she came back, she did not speak about where she had been or what she had been thinking. She was 6 years old, but something had settled in her during those 3 days that would not unsettle again. A specific, clear, unargued, with conviction that the life of continuous giving that she had just witnessed, the life of the body placed in service of others' arrivals and departures, was not the life she was going to live. She did not say this to anyone. She was 6 years old, and she was the eldest daughter in a Chinese merchant family in early 20th century Thailand. And the gap between what she had decided and what her world expected of her was wide enough that announcing it would have accomplished nothing except make the people she loved worry about her. So she said nothing. She helped in the shop. She learned the accounts. She grew up with the particular competence of someone who is doing what is required with their whole attention while keeping something else, something separate and untouched, in a part of themselves that the requirements cannot reach. This was the planted question, not dramatic, not a crisis, but the quietest kind of pressure. Could you live a life that is not yet your own without losing the thread back to what is? She was mostly self-taught. This detail matters more than it might seem. There were no meditation teachers in Ratchaburi who would have taken her as a student, not a young laywoman from a Chinese merchant family, with no monastic connections and no formal standing in the religious hierarchy. What there were books. The Pali Canon in Thai translation. The works of the forest teachers who were beginning to write down what they had previously transmitted only person to person. She ordered them from Bangkok, wrapped in oiled cloth against the river damp, and read them in the evenings after the accounts were done. By the light of the oil lamp on the table where she had sat every evening since she was old enough to be trusted with the accounts. She read them the way someone reads a map of a country they have already decided to travel to, not to decide whether to go, but to understand what the terrain will ask of her when she arrives. She sat in meditation in the early mornings before the shop opened, in the small room at the back of the house that faced the garden, where a single frangipani tree dropped its flowers into the wet grass without concern for whether anyone was watching. The meditation she developed was not the formal instruction of a lineage passed teacher to student across centuries. It was her own construction, built from reading and tested in what she later called her relentless honesty, which was not harshness but its opposite, the quality of someone who has decided that the one thing she cannot afford is self-deception. She sat and she watched her mind. She noted what was constructed and what was simply present. She discarded what did not survive contact with what was actually true. She kept what did. Her father grew older. The shop required more, not less. She managed it, as she had always managed it, with the full attention of someone who understands that the thing in front of you deserves your full attention, regardless of whether it is the thing you would have chosen. She cooked. She kept the accounts. She was good at all of it. There is a version of this story that makes those 20 years sound like a prison, and it is the wrong version. What she was doing was not suffering through a borrowed life while waiting for her own. She was paying attention, with the same quality of attention she brought to the meditation, to what it meant to be in a body, in a family, in a specific arrangement of obligations that she had not chosen but that were, for now, hers. She had learned the practice from books, alone, without a teacher. The way a person learns the name of a country they have always known they will one day live in. The years continued. She taught herself more. Her knowledge deepened in the particular way that self-taught knowledge deepens, not in the straight line of formal instruction but in spirals, returning to the same passages each time with more understanding than the last, finding things she had not been ready to find before. She had no sangha, no community of practitioners to compare notes with, no teacher to correct her when she went sideways. What she had was the practice itself, and the honesty she had decided was non-negotiable, and the quiet, early mornings with the frangipani tree. There were years when the practice felt very close, when the early mornings opened into something spacious and the breath became what it was without effort. There were other years when it felt like pushing against a door that had no handle on her side, when the shop and the accounts and the noise of the market pressed up against the small room, and she sat in the gap between what was required of her and what she actually was, and simply continued to sit. She did not make a virtue of this. She did not tell herself a story about patience or sacrifice. She sat, because sitting was what she did, the way a river continues, because continuing is what rivers do, not because they have decided to be admirable. She was not accumulating merit. She was not building toward a reward. She was paying attention, one morning at a time, to the difference between the mind that performs and the mind that simply knows. This distinction between the knowing that is already present and the knowing that is constructed for an audience was the thread she was following. Alone, with no map except the books and no verification except the honesty she had promised herself at the beginning. Her father became ill in the last years of the war. She cared for him with the same complete attention she had brought to everything else, not duty performed against the grain of desire, but the natural expression of love in the form available to her. In those last months, she taught him to meditate. He was an old man and not particularly interested in Buddhism as a formal pursuit. But he was sick and frightened in the specific way of people who have been practical and capable their whole lives and have arrived at the one circumstance practicality cannot manage. She sat with him in the evenings after the shop was closed, in the same small room, and taught him simply to watch the breath, to notice what arose and passed, to let the mind settle without requiring it to be something other than what it was. One evening he asked her, "Does it get easier?" She said, "You do not have to become anything, Father. You only have to notice what is already here." He died in 1945. She sat with his body through the night, in the same quality of attention she had brought to the frangipani tree in the early mornings, present, without needing to make it different from what it was. Outside, the rains were heavier than usual that year, and the river ran very high, and the town smelled of all the things that wet seasons bring, including the smell of things that are ending and things that are beginning, which are not always different smells. She put down the key to the shop and did not look back, not because she had stopped caring, but because she had finally understood that caring and carrying are not the same thing. She climbed the hill. The hill was not far from the town, but it was high enough that the sounds of the market did not reach it, and the air was different at the top, cleaner, with the smell of dry grass and warm stone and the faint sweetness of the trees that grew in the ravine below the western face. The abandoned monastic structure on the summit had been empty long enough that the roof had developed opinions about whether it wished to continue being a roof. But the walls were sound, and the view to the west, where the sky went very open and still in the evenings, was exactly what a person needs when they have been living inside a smaller space for a long time and need the reminder that larger spaces exist. She came with her aunt and uncle, who were elderly and had decided that what remained of their lives would be better spent in this direction. They built a small community from what was there. Students began to come, first a few, then more, then many. She taught from her own practice, in the direct manner of someone who has tested everything she is offering and discarded what did not survive the testing. She did not perform authority. She did not claim a lineage she had not received. She spoke from what she knew in the plain language she had always preferred, and the plain language turned out to be what people needed. She taught for more than 30 years. She went blind near the end and continued teaching. The darkness, she said in those last years, was not the obstacle it might have seemed. She had been practicing in the dark for a very long time. Let that rest in you now. There is something in this story that is not about renunciation. Key did not escape her life. She lived it. Completely. The shop, the father, the early mornings, the books with their pages, that had been turned by no hand but hers. She kept the thread, not dramatically, not with visible heroism. She kept it the way you keep a flame in wind, with the body turned slightly, with an attention so quiet it is almost indistinguishable from simply being present. You may know something about this, the years of what is required, while something else, small, persistent, unhurried, continues in a part of you that the requirements cannot touch. The practice you have kept alive without anyone knowing you were keeping it. The thing you return to, in the early mornings or the late nights, that is entirely yours. Think of the last time you did something that was only for you. Not performed, not reported, not shaped for anyone else's understanding of you. A small thing, perhaps, a walk you took alone, a few minutes of stillness before the day required you, a moment when you stopped translating yourself into a language someone else could read and simply existed in your own. That moment, however small, is where the thread runs. Key found it in a room with a frangipani tree. You have your own room. You have been finding your way back to it longer than you know. The thread has not broken. You would know if it had. The fact that you are here, in this particular dark, following these particular lives, that is the thread. Still intact, still in your hand. You do not have to become anything tonight. You only have to notice what is already here. Let the breath be what is here, the weight of the body against whatever holds it, the specific temperature of the air against the skin of the hands, the face, wherever the air and the body meet. These are not obstacles to rest. They are the texture of arriving. Let the whole length of the spine soften now, from the base to the place where the neck begins. Not straightened, not corrected, simply allowed to be the length it is, held by whatever holds it, needing nothing more than that. Let the breath come and go without assistance. It has been doing this all night, without your supervision, without your help. Let it continue. That is enough. That has always been enough. If sleep is already at the edges, let it come closer. The thread does not require your wakefulness to remain intact. It is not made of attention. It is made of something older than attention, something that was there before you learned the word for it, and that will continue in the silence where words end. And in a country where the winters arrive without announcement and the rivers run the color of old pewter in the months before they freeze, a monk was sitting in front of a student who had just asked him the question that the monk had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to ask. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun without urgency, falling past the window in the particular, unhurried way of something that has arrived and is not in any hurry to leave. The clouds above Siamushan moved the way clouds move at high altitude in autumn, which is to say, without urgency and without particular interest in where they were going, simply occupying the available space in the way that things which have nowhere to be tend to do. Below the summit, the forest was the color of things that have been slowly turning for weeks without anyone noticing, until one morning the whole mountain has changed and you cannot say when it happened. The sound of a stream somewhere below, following the crease in the rock that it had been following long before the forest grew up around it. The smell of wet stone and pine, and the particular sharpness of high mountain air that has not passed through anything warmer than cloud in a long time. And from somewhere in the bamboo to the east, a sound that was not the wind. Shiwu was chopping wood. He was 79 years old, which in the 14th century in China, in the mountains, doing the work that mountain living requires, was a different kind of 79 than the kind that happens in cities. His hands were the hands of someone who had been doing the work of hands for a very long time. Not elegant, not the hands a painter or a calligrapher would be proud of, but hands that knew what they were doing without requiring consultation from the mind above them. The axe fell in the particular rhythm of someone who has done this enough times that the body has learned to do it more efficiently than the mind would have chosen. He had been on this mountain for 9 years now, in his second tenure as a hermit. The first had been 20 years, from the time he arrived in 1312 until the monks from the lower monastery came in 1331 with their careful arguments about why a man of his experience and reputation should not be living alone on a mountain when there were so many people who needed what he had to offer. In between the two mountain periods, there had been 8 years as abbot of Fuyuan Monastery, 100 kilometers to the east, which felt from this altitude like a place that existed in a different version of the world, not a worse version, simply a different one, with different requirements and a different quality of air. He set the axe down. He looked at what he had cut. It was enough for several days. The stove in the hut was small and did not require heroic quantities of fuel, which was one of the many things he had come to appreciate about it. This was the planted question, not why he had left the monastery, which could be answered simply enough, but why the leaving had taken 8 years, and what had kept him there so long in a life that did not fit him. He had not intended to stay. When the monks of Fuyuan came to his mountain in 1331, after 20 years of him living here quietly, growing vegetables and composing the verses that a few people in the monasteries below had begun to pass between themselves as something worth reading, he had been reluctant. The mountain suited him. The mountain had always suited him in a way that was difficult to articulate to people who had not lived on one. It was not that it was beautiful, though it was, or that it was peaceful, though it had that quality, but that on the mountain no one was watching him to see whether he was being the right kind of monk. The clouds were not watching. The stream was not assessing. The oriole that appeared in the bamboo after spring rains was not wondering what Shiwu thought about the nature of enlightenment. It simply appeared, sang its specific song, and disappeared, and the mountain was the same before and after. He had gone down. He told himself it would be for a year, perhaps 2. The monks needed guidance. The monastery was struggling. His reputation had grown to the point where refusing seemed like its own kind of pride. The abbot's quarters at Fuyuan were comfortable in a way that made him uncomfortable. Not because he was opposed to comfort. He was old enough and honest enough to have moved past the performance of asceticism for its own sake, but because the comfort came wrapped in an identity that did not belong to him. He was the abbot. He was the one people came to when they had questions that required the abbot's quality of attention. He gave that attention. He was genuinely good at it. The monastery functioned under his leadership with a smoothness that the records would later attribute to his wisdom, and he did not entirely disagree. But he noticed something in the giving of it that the records did not capture. He was watching himself be the abbot the way he sometimes watched the clouds, with appreciation for the view, but from a specific remove. The monks who came to him came to the abbot, which was fair, because they needed the abbot, and the abbot was what was available. But Shiwu, in the room where the abbot sat, I noticed that the thing the monks were receiving was real and useful, and also not quite him. It was the version of him that 8 centuries of Chan Buddhist tradition had refined into a specific kind of vessel, a vessel for other people's thirst. shaped by their need, filling when they arrived, empty when they left. A useful shape, not his own. On the mountain, the rain had fallen into him without asking what he was for. He stayed 8 years. This requires explanation, because it was not 8 years of suffering through an ill-fitting life. It was 8 years of doing something real and doing it well, and gradually, without drama, coming to understand that well done and right are not always the same thing. The monastery was large, as Yuan dynasty monasteries went, a compound of halls and courtyards and sleeping quarters for several hundred monks, with its own kitchen gardens and a reputation for rigorous practice that drew students from 3 provinces. The administration of such a place required attention to things that were not spiritual in the formal sense, but were also not trivial. The accounts, the maintenance, the disputes between senior monks that arose with the regularity of weather and needed the same kind of management. Shiwu handled all of it. He handled it with the patient thoroughness of someone who had learned on the mountain that the practical and the contemplative are not separate categories, but a single category seen from different angles. He taught. This was the part that suited him most, or that suited the part of him that the monastery could see. Monks came to him with their obstructions, their koans that had gone cold, their practice that had hardened into habit. He knew how to soften what had hardened. He had done it himself, more than once, in the years on the mountain when he noticed the practice becoming a performance of the practice and had to find the thing underneath the performance again. He gave good instruction. He was honest in it. The records from this period describe a teacher of exceptional clarity, and this was not incorrect. But he was watching himself be the abbot the way he sometimes watched the clouds, with appreciation for the view, but from a specific remove. The monks who came to him came to the abbot, which was fair, because they needed the abbot, and the abbot was what was available. But Shiwu, in the room where the abbot sat, noticed that the thing the monks were receiving was real and useful, and also not quite him. It was the version of him that 8 centuries of Chan Buddhist tradition had refined into a specific kind of vessel, a vessel for other people's thirst, shaped by their need, filling when they arrived, empty when they left. A useful shape, not his own. On the mountain, the rain had fallen into him without asking what he was for. He stayed 8 years. The monastery needed him. He provided what was needed. And each year, when the autumn came and the mountains north of the monastery turned the color that mountains turn in autumn, he felt something that was not quite longing and not quite grief, closer to the recognition of a person who has left a window open and can smell, from wherever they are sitting, the air from outside. In 1339, he asked the senior monks to find a replacement. They protested. He waited. He was 70 years old, and he had spent 20 years learning what suited him, and 8 years confirming it. By contrast, and he was not interested in further argument on the subject. He walked back to Shiamushan. The hut he had built 30 years before was gone. Not dramatically, not burned or destroyed, simply resolved back into the mountain in the way wooden structures resolve when no one is maintaining them, and the mountain continues doing what mountains do. He found the posts still standing, the roof long since collapsed inward. The floor of packed earth returned to something closer to the forest floor around it. A vine had grown through the eastern wall, with the patient indifference of vegetation that does not recognize walls as a category distinct from any other surface. He rebuilt it. He cut new timber from the slope above. He replaced the roof over the course of several weeks. working alone in the mornings and resting in the afternoons when the light went flat and the mountain sounds went very still. He gathered stones for the stove. He dug out the vegetable bed from under the years of fallen leaves. He moved back into a structure that was both the same place and entirely new, which seemed, if he allowed himself the observation, exactly right. He had the same hands he had always had, the ones that had signed the abbot's documents, and the ones that had planted vegetables 30 years before on this same slope. The hut was rebuilt with those hands, both of them. The abbot's hands, the hermit's hands, the 70-year-old hands of a man who had learned the difference between the useful and the true, and had, this time, without hesitation, chosen. The hands did not know the difference between the two periods, but he did. The monks from the lower monasteries still came to visit. They climbed the mountain with their questions and their notebooks and their carefully prepared koans, arriving with slightly more breath than was comfortable at this altitude, and the particular expressions of people who have been anticipating a conversation and are not sure whether the person they have come to see will be available in the way they hope. He received them in the hut or outside it, depending on the weather, and answered some questions and turned others back without answering them, which was sometimes more useful. One young monk asked him, one afternoon, when the clouds were doing what clouds do at high altitude in the season, when they cannot decide whether to become rain, what Shiwu did up here all day. He looked at the monk for a moment. Then he said, "I watch the clouds. I forget to watch the clouds. Then I watch them again." The monk wrote this down. Shiwu watched him write it down and did not say anything further. The clouds continued with their own business overhead, indifferent to whether anyone was drawing instruction from them. In the monastery he had been a vessel for other people's thirst. On the mountain the rain fell into him without asking what he was for. He spent his remaining years on the mountain. He was asked, in the last years, to write down what he found interesting about the life he was living. He sat quietly and let his brush move. 184 poems, composed in a period of a few months, emerged from that sitting. Not poems about enlightenment in the formal sense, not doctrinal instruction dressed in verse, but poems about the actual texture of days lived in a place that required nothing of him but his presence. The tea stove, black with soot, the broken-legged pot, the stream that could be heard through the eastern wall, the clouds. He died in 1352 on the mountain. The records note that he died without significant ceremony. This seems, given everything, like the right way. Let that arrive wherever it wants to arrive. There is a specific tiredness that comes not from the things you have done wrong, but from the things you have done very well in a shape that was not yours. The competent performance of a borrowed role. The years when you were genuinely good at being someone that other people needed and genuinely aware, somewhere underneath the competence, that the person being good at it was not entirely you. You may know the precise texture of this. The meeting you ran well, the role you filled with care, the version of yourself you brought to a situation because it was what the situation required, and then the moment afterward, in the car, or in the elevator, or in the bathroom with the door closed, when the version quietly stepped aside and something quieter and less named was briefly, uncomplicatedly there. That something is not a failure. It is not even a problem. It is the thing underneath the shape, still present, still intact, waiting with the patience of a mountain for the times when the shape is not required. You do not have to do anything with that recognition tonight. Shiwu sat in the abbot's chair for 8 years before he walked back up the mountain. The recognition does not require immediate action. It only requires that you stop pretending not to have it. You do not have to be useful tonight. You do not have to be anything that requires a title, or a function, or a particular quality of attention that the situation demands. You can simply be the one who is here, watching whatever passes, forgetting, watching again. The clouds do not perform their movement. They simply move. And the mountain that has been here longer than anyone has been watching it is not diminished by the times when no one was watching. It simply was. It is. Let the breath be like that now. Not performed, not observed with the quality of someone checking whether it is being done correctly. Simply moving, the way it has always moved. The way it will move after you fall asleep without noticing the transition. Let the hands rest now, wherever they have settled. They have been useful today. They do not need to continue being useful in the dark. If sleep has already been moving through you for some time, let it finish what it started. The mountain does not require you to be awake for this. Nothing requires you to be awake for this. And much further south, in the forests of a country where the trees hold their leaves through the cold months, because the cold there is not cold enough to persuade them otherwise. A woman who had spent 40 years being useful in ways that no one around her had thought to name, was sitting with a bowl of water that had gone completely still. The monsoon had broken 2 weeks before, and Rangoon was doing what Rangoon does after the rains end, releasing the accumulated heat of weeks of cloud cover back into the air all at once, so that the city smelled of wet earth drying and the particular sweetness of vegetation that has been very wet for a long time and is now very warm. The frangipanis along the monastery walls had dropped most of their flowers in the rain and were now putting out new ones, white and yellow against the dark green. The smell of them specific and slightly sweet in the heavy afternoon air. The sound of the city going about its business, bicycle wheels, a vendor's call from 2 streets over. The particular sound of a city that has learned to keep moving through weather that periodically makes movement difficult. And from the Kamayat Meditation Center, set back from the street behind its compound wall, almost nothing. The silence of a place that has been holding a specific kind of attention for long enough that the silence has become its own kind of sound. Inside, a woman named Nani was learning, for the first time in her life, to sit still. She was 46 years old, and she was not well. This is the understated version of the truth. The accurate version is that she had been bedridden for the better part of 2 years, heart disease, hypertension, legs that would not do what legs were supposed to do, and that her doctor, having offered her what medicine could offer and watched it fail to be sufficient, had suggested, with the careful neutrality of a person suggesting something they are not entirely certain is medicine, that she try meditation. She had come to the center the way a person comes to the last thing on a list, not with hope, exactly, but with the absence of alternatives. This was the planted question she sat with in that first week, on the meditation cushion in the room with the other practitioners. In the specific silence of people concentrating, what does a woman who has spent 40 years being necessary to other people find? In the first weeks of her life, when she is not necessary to anyone. She had been married at 12 to a kind man twice her age, which was simply how things were done in the Bengali Buddhist community of early 20th century East Bengal. And she had been a good wife with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. When her mother died unexpectedly, she and her husband took in the baby brother Nani's mother left behind and raised him as their own, which was also simply what was done, and Nani did it with the same complete attention. She had wanted children. The wanting had cost her 3 infants before her daughter Dipper arrived in 1950 and survived. And Nani had spent the years of those losses doing what she did, with everything continuing. Completely, without the luxury of stopping. Her husband had been the anchor of the life they built together in Rangoon, where he worked as an engineer for the government, and she made their home and raised Dipper and cooked and managed the accounts, and did what a wife and mother did in 1950s Burma, which was everything that the word everything actually contains. He came home one afternoon complaining of a pain in his chest. Within hours he was dead. She collapsed. Not dramatically, not as metaphor. Her body, which had been managing heart disease and high blood pressure through the force of having too much to do to be sick, stopped managing. She was confined to bed. The weeks became months. Deepa was there. The remaining family was there. People came and went and helped and were kind. Nani lay in the bed and felt the grief for her husband, which was enormous. And underneath it, something that frightened her more than the grief, the absence of purpose. She had been needed her entire life. She was not needed now in the way she had always understood being needed. There was nothing for her hands to do that other hands could not do. She could not hold the household together from her bed. She could only be in the bed, which she had never been asked to be before, in the entire of her life. She had spent 40 years being necessary. Now she was not necessary to anyone. Deepa was old enough to manage. The brother was grown. The husband was gone. And Nani lay with a heart the doctors were watching carefully. And grief so large, she had no container for it. She who had always had a container for everything. She had been the vessel. The vessel was cracked. At the meditation center, she sat. She received instruction in the way that was offered, quiet, precise, practical, the way the Burmese Theravada tradition taught in those years, focused on the breath and the body and the arising and passing of sensation. Nothing more elaborate than that. The instruction was given by monks who were themselves quiet and precise. Men who had spent years in exactly this quality of attention and had the particular economy of movement and speech that long practice produces, saying what needed to be said. Nothing more. Nani listened. She had always been a good listener. In the practical sense, she paid attention to what people needed. Now she was being asked to pay attention to something that needed nothing from her. She sat for hours at a time. She had nowhere else to be. And this was the first time in her adult life that had been true. The first days were not peaceful. The mind, presented with silence after decades of organized busyness, does what minds do. It filled the silence with everything it had been too occupied to process. The grief for her husband, which she had not had time or room to fully inhabit, arrived in the sitting with the patience of something that has been waiting and knows it will eventually be received. She sat with it. The grief for the children she had lost, the 2 before Deepa. The son who came after arrived as well, in the specific textures of specific memories, and she sat with those too. She did not push them away. She had been taught not to push them away. She watched them arise and watched them pass, which they did, in time, the way everything passes when you stop spending your energy trying to prevent the passing. After several weeks, the grief began to change. Not to end, she would carry the grief for her husband for the rest of her life, and would say, so openly, but to change in quality. It became something she was aware of rather than something she was submerged in. And in the space that opened, she began to notice something she had not been looking for. What happened in those weeks is not mysterious if you understand that the self that appears when all its roles have been removed is not emptiness, but clarity. Nani had been a daughter, a wife, a mother, a sister, a keeper of a household, a person whose days had been organized entirely around what other people needed from her. She had done all of this with her full self. There was no part of her that had been held back from the giving. And now, in the silence of the center, with the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and the sound of the city just audible through the compound wall, and nothing required of her by anyone, she sat with what remained when the giving stopped. It was not nothing. The thing she found in the sitting was not new. This is important. She had not gone somewhere and retrieved something from outside herself. She had been sitting with what had always been there, underneath the decades of useful, necessary, genuine service to other people's lives. The practice did not install it. It cleared away the accumulation. The way a stream clears silt, not by adding water, but by moving, gently, persistently, in the only direction available to it. The meditation did not give her anything she had not always had. It only removed, one layer at a time, the names she had been given for it. Her health improved. Her heart symptoms lessened. The legs that had refused to hold her began again to hold her. She emerged from the center after several months, a different quality of person, not different in identity, but different in availability. The way a room becomes different when what was stored in it has been cleared, without the room itself having changed at all. She stayed to teach. She did not intend to become a teacher. She was a householder, a grandmother, a woman who cooked on a charcoal stove on the floor and slept on a thin mat and shared a toilet with the family next door in the small room above the machine shop in Calcutta where she and Deepa lived after the Burmese government expelled all foreigners in 1967. The room had no running water. The shop below made a sound that she described, to students who asked about it, as simply the sound of where they lived. She had lived in many places, in different conditions, and had found that the conditions were less relevant than she had expected them to be. She was not a monk. She had no lineage title. She had no formal credentials in any system that issued credentials. She was a Bengali grandmother who had survived grief and illness and displacement and had, in the process, found something that she was now unable to not share. The way a person who has found the path to water cannot, when they meet someone thirsty, pretend they do not know where it is. People appeared at her door, first a few, then more, mostly women, mostly householders like herself, women who had children and households and demands, and no time for extended retreats, but who had found their way to the small room above the grinding sound because someone had told them that a woman there knew something about how to be alive without being exhausted by it. Deepa Ma taught them from the chair where she sat. With her grandson Rishi on her lap, or loose in the small apartment, investigating whatever a small boy finds interesting, she taught them the practice she had been taught, but adapted it, because she understood from her own life that the sitting cushion was not the only place where practice was possible. She taught a young mother how to meditate while nursing. She taught a woman who cooked for a large family how to be present in the kitchen in a way that the kitchen became, instead of an obligation, a practice. She taught women who had 30 minutes while children napped, and she did not tell them that 30 minutes was insufficient. She told them what matters is the quality of attention, not the duration of the sitting. One student asked her how she could teach meditation while cooking and talking and caring for Rishi, who was often climbing on her during teachings. She looked at the student with the direct, warm attention she brought to everything. She said, "I am always meditating. When I talk, I am meditating. When I cook, I am meditating. This is not something you do. It is something you stop covering up." The Western teachers who came to her in those years, young Americans who would go on to teach Vipassana meditation to hundreds of thousands of people, described sitting with her as the experience of being in the Vipassana presence of someone who had no remainder, who was not, in any moment, partly elsewhere, who brought to the conversation with a stranger the same quality of complete attention she brought to prayer. They asked her how. She found the question slightly bewildering. The way you find bewildering a question about something so fundamental you had stopped noticing it as a choice. She said, "I am here. This is where I am. Where else would I be?" She died in 1989 in Calcutta, in the room she had taught from, among the people she had taught. She was 78. She had spent the last 30 years of her life giving away the things she found in the weeks when she had nothing left to give. And the giving had not diminished it, which she had always known it would not, because things that are actual do not diminish in the sharing. They clarify. Let that be enough now. Let it arrive wherever it arrives. She had spent 40 years being necessary. Now she was not necessary to anyone. And in that space, something she had carried so long, she had mistaken it for herself, quietly set itself down. Not the vessel, not the role, the thing underneath the role, which turned out to be the only part that had ever been hers. Think of a moment, perhaps in the evening, perhaps when something you had been dreading all day was finally over, or when the last obligation of the week was complete, when you were briefly not needed by anyone, even if only for an hour. The quality of that space before you filled it again with something else. Before the planning for tomorrow began, before the list reformed, that space is not accidental. It is not the absence of your life. It is the ground your life has been resting on the entire time, without your having to tend it, without your knowing it was there. Deepa Ma found this in the particular emptiness of loss. You do not need loss to find it. You only need to stop, for a moment, filling it. You do not have to find it. You only have to stop covering it up. It has been here the whole time, under the names, under the roles, under the weight of everything. You have been for everyone who needed you to be it. It is here now. In this room, in this dark, in this breath that arrives and leaves without your direction. It does not require your attention. It has been here without your attention for your entire life. Let the body sink now into whatever holds it. The mattress, the chair, the floor beneath. Let it receive the full weight. There is no part of you that has to stay ready. Let the eyes be completely still behind the closed lids. Let the small muscles of the face release, the ones that hold expression even when no expression is needed, the ones that have been working since morning. They can stop now. No one is watching. Nothing requires a face tonight. If sleep comes, it comes. If it has already been moving through you for some time now, it is welcome. The room is quiet. The grinding below has stopped for the night. What remains is simply what remains. The breath, the dark, the particular quality of a night that is asking nothing of you at all. And to the northeast, in the country where the great rivers converge before spreading into the delta, where the monsoon comes and goes with the certainty of things that have been happening for longer than memory, a young man sat beside a dying teacher and received the only instruction the teacher had left to give, which was no instruction at all. Only a hand resting open on a worn cloth, the fingers uncurled. End of story w tej. W home, Claude, story 7, Dipama. Ducks. The river that ran past the foot of Hamlong Mountain moved with the patient quality of rivers that have been moving for longer than the roads beside them, carrying its particular brown-green through the flat light of early morning, without urgency and without apparent destination, though it had one. Along the banks, the bamboo grew the way bamboo grows in central Vietnam, in dense stands that produce, when the wind moves through them, not one sound, but several sounds layered the higher whisper of leaves, the lower creak of comb against comb, the occasional crack of a stalk that has grown too fast for its own joints. Herons stood in the shallows with the focused indifference of birds that have been doing this for millions of years and have arrived at a quality of patience that is no longer patience because it no longer involves waiting. The temple of Thien To sat on the slope above the river, its roof lines visible as small, dark curves against the sky. The smell of incense from the main hall, which had been burning since before the birds began, drifting down the slope and mixing with the river smell and the bamboo smell, and the particular damp warmth of a central Vietnamese morning that has not yet decided how hot it intends to become. Inside the temple grounds, in the small cell that had been assigned to him, Liu Quan had been sitting since the 3rd hour of the morning. He was 33 years old, which is to say, he had been practicing for more than 20 years with the seriousness of someone who began young enough that the practice and the formation of his character happened simultaneously and cannot now be entirely separated from each other. He had lost his mother at 6. His father had brought him to the temple at 12. He had learned what it meant to be completely present long before he had a name for it. In the way that certain things are learned when the circumstances of a life offer no alternative. He had been given a koan 5 years before, but the story begins earlier than that. In the year his first teacher died, he had come to the temple at 12. When his father brought him to Hoi Ton Temple in Phu Yen province, the way that rural families in 17th century central Vietnam sometimes brought their children to temples, not as an abandonment, but as an act of hope, an offering of the child to a community that could give the child things the family could not. He had stayed. He had studied under the abbot Tevien, who was Chinese and rigorous and not interested in students who were only partially present, which suited Liu Quan because partial presence had never been available to him. He gave himself to the practice with the totality of someone who has decided that the thing in front of him is the thing, and for 9 years this was what his life was. Then Tevien died, and the life changed shape. He went north to Hue to study with a new teacher. A year into this, the word came from his village. His father was ill. He asked permission to leave the temple. His teacher gave it. He went home. He became a logger. This detail, which the biographical records include without elaborating, deserves more attention than it typically receives. He was 23 years old, a monk in training with 9 years of serious practice behind him, and he spent 4 years in the forests of Phu Yen province cutting and hauling timber to support a sick father. The forests of that region were dense and tropical, full of the specific sounds and smells of things that grow very fast in wet heat. The crack of bamboo in the morning cold, the smell of resin from cut timber, the weight of logs on the shoulder across uneven ground. He worked. His father grew worse, then better, then worse again. He cared for him with the attention the practice had developed in him, the same quality of presence that had marked him as a serious student. Turned now toward the entirely practical work of keeping another person alive. His father died 4 years after he had come home. He buried his father in the village ground with the rites that the village used, which were not purely Buddhist and not purely Confucian and not purely the animist traditions that the coastal communities of Fujian province had been practicing since before either of those names arrived in the region. They have me were the rites of people who had absorbed everything available and kept what seemed to work, which is what traditions do when they are genuinely alive rather than performed. Then he returned to the temple. He was not the same person who had left. The years of cutting timber had changed the body. The years of watching another person die by degrees had changed something in the understanding that is harder to name than the body. He came back with a quality of settledness that his new teacher noticed immediately, not the settledness of someone who has found peace, but the settledness of someone who has learned that being disturbed and being present are not mutually exclusive, that it is possible to hold grief and attention in the same hands. He was ordained as a full monk in 1697, which was to say he was 30 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades moving toward this moment by a route that included years of formal practice, years of physical labor, years of grief, and years of care. He came to the cushion not as someone who had been protected from the world while preparing to understand it, but as someone who knew what timber weighed and what grief felt like in the body over 4 sustained years, and what it meant to be completely present with another person who needed presence and could not ask for it directly. He had been given a koan 5 years before this story finds him. The master Tu Dung had given it to him with the economy of a teacher who had decided the student was ready, or ready enough. The koan was, "This all dharmas return to the One." Where will the One return to? Liu Quan had understood immediately that he did not understand it. This is a specific kind of understanding that only the koan tradition produces. The understanding that the question is not the kind of question that understanding answers. He had taken it back to his cushion. He had sat with it through 5 monsoons and 5 dry seasons. He had carried it through the temple's daily routines, through the chanting and the meals and the maintenance and the instruction he gave to younger monks. He had carried it the way you carry something you have been told is the most important thing you will ever be asked to carry, with the full attention of someone who takes such instructions seriously. The same full attention he had given to the timber and to his father's illness and to the 9 years with Tavien. This was the planted question. Though it had been planted 5 years before the story finds him, could a man carry the right question long enough, carefully enough, with the particular quality of attention he had spent his whole life developing, to arrive somewhere new? Or was there something the question required that was not available through effort, however sustained? He had tried everything he had. He had sat in the formal posture for hours, until the legs protested and he had ignored the legs. He had brought the koan into walking, holding it in the mind the way you hold a stone in the palm, aware of its weight and texture without gripping. He had brought it into eating, into the silence of the communal meal where the mind is neither required nor forbidden. He had brought it into the dark hours, into the threshold between sleeping and waking, where the habitual structures of the mind loosen, and something underneath them sometimes becomes briefly, incompletely visible. The years with his father had not been wasted years. He knew this. They had given him something that the cushion could not have given him alone. The experience of caring for someone who could not be fixed, only accompanied. The experience of being useful in ways that had no endpoint, no resolution, only continuation. He had learned in those 4 years, that the most important thing was not to understand but to remain, to not leave. He had brought this quality to the koan. He had not left the koan. He had remained with it. Nothing had broken open. He had been carrying the question the way you carry a lamp, not seeing that the lamp was already the light he was looking for. He was sitting in his cell when the Master Tu Dung passed the door. This requires no elaboration in the historical record, which is spare in the way of Chan records generally. Tu Dung called from outside, "Yesterday's question is not finished. Answer me again." Liu Quan sat with this for a moment, not deliberating, not searching through what he had accumulated in 5 years of carrying. Simply, there, in the cell, with the morning coming through the high window, and the river smell from below, and the bamboo sound from the slope, and the incense from the hall, and nothing required of him in this moment but to be in it. He said, "If I had known the lamp is fire itself, the meal would have been ready a long time ago." Tudong, outside the door, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come and eat." What Liu Quan described later, in the compressed and careful language available to someone trying to put into words something that words were not made for, was not a flash of light or a dissolution of the self, or any of the more dramatic formulations the tradition sometimes reaches for when trying to communicate this particular kind of shift. It was more like, he said, the moment when you stop trying to see something in the dark and the dark turns out to have been your own hand, which has been in front of your face the whole time. And the not seeing was not a failure of vision but a failure to recognize what was already being seen. The bowl was not waiting to be filled. The bowl and what filled it had never been two different things. He received the transmission from Tu Dung and went into the world. Not into the silence of a hermitage or the elevated remove of a court appointment, into the actual world of central Vietnam in the early 18th century, with its complicated political weather, its coastal fishing communities, its rice farmers and merchants, and the Nguyen lords who managed the southern territories with varying degrees of wisdom and brutality. He built a meditation center at the foot of Nubing Mountain, not because the mountain was sacred, but because the mountain was there, and the community that gathered around the center grew with the organic logic of things that meet an actual need. He taught in the plain speech of central Vietnam, not in the elevated diction of the Chinese lineage he had received, not in the formal register of court Buddhism, but in the language people spoke when they were being direct about things that mattered. His students described his teaching as the voice of someone who had stopped translating himself and was speaking from what he actually knew. This is a different thing than speaking simply. Simple can be performed. This was not performed. The Wen lords came to hear him, and he received them without particular adjustment, with the same quality of attention he gave to the families who came with their ordinary griefs and questions, and the monks who came with their formal koans. He was invited to the royal palace. He declined, not dramatically, not with a message about the corruption of court life. He simply did not go. He was not interested in being the court Buddhist, which is a specific role with specific requirements that would have asked him to be a particular kind of useful in ways that did not align with what he understood his life to be for. He had learned this from the years with his father. The most important thing is to remain, not to be impressive, not to be important, to remain completely in the place where you actually are. He ordained thousands of students across the decades. He presided over regional ceremonies. He wrote the verse transmission that his lineage still carries, the words that encode the Dharma name of each generation of practitioners who follow him, so that a person studying with Thich Nhat Hanh in France in the 20th century is, in some formal sense, the 42nd or 43rd generation of the chain that runs back through this small temple on a mountain above a river in central Vietnam. To the morning, a teacher called through a cell door, and the student said something true about a lamp. He died in 1742. He asked for brush and paper. He wrote, "I have lived for more than 70 years in this world. I have grasped what is emptiness and what is outward appearance. Today I come back home with fulfillment. No need to trouble ancestry with any questions." Then he set the brush down. The bowl was not waiting to be filled. The bowl and what filled it had never been two different things. Let this settle now, gently. The question you have been carrying, the one so close you have stopped noticing its weight, does not require an answer tonight. It may not require an answer in the way you have been imagining answers work. Lu Quan carried his for 5 years, and it broke open, not in the formal sitting, but in a single ordinary sentence on an ordinary morning when he had stopped, briefly, trying to carry it correctly. The thing you have been looking for has been looking through your eyes the whole time. You do not have to find it. You are it finding. Let the breath move now without your management. In and out. The lamp that is already the fire. The bowl that was never waiting to be filled. Let the weight of the night have you completely. The body has known how to rest since before you knew you had a body. What is required now is only the small permission to stop proving that you are awake. Let the brow be smooth. Let whatever thought has been waiting to form simply not form. There is nothing it needs to become tonight. The night does not require your conclusions. If sleep is here, it is here. If it is coming, let it come. There is nothing left to carry tonight. And somewhere much further north, where the seasons press harder and the cold has more intention in it, a very old man was being asked by a student to say something final, and the old man had understood, finally, that the last teaching and the last silence were the same thing. End of story. The wind across the Mongolian steppe in late autumn does not arrive from one direction. It arrives from all of them, in the particular, undecided way of winds that have nothing to slow them down for several hundred kilometers in any direction, and so have not developed the directional habits that winds acquire when they must navigate between mountains or through valleys. The grass had gone. The color that Mongolian grass goes in late autumn, a yellow that is not quite gold and not quite brown, but something between. The color of things that have finished their main work and are resting before the ground freezes. The sky above was the high, clear blue of altitude and cold, a blue that seems closer than sky usually does, as though the air is thinner and the sky is pressing down through it. The smell of cold and dry grass, and the distant, faint smell of horse, which in this part of the world in this century is simply the smell of human presence. The way salt is the smell of the sea, in a tent that had been set with the specific order of a place where someone works rather than merely rests. A man named Zanabazar was holding a piece of bronze. He was past 60, which, in 17th century Mongolia, was an age that commanded a specific kind of attention. The attention given to someone who has survived the accumulation of difficulties that the steppe provides in quantity. His hands were the hands of a sculptor who had been working for 50 years, which is to say, they were precise, and they were patient, and they had the quality of instruments that have been used so long for their intended purpose that they have become, in some sense, the purpose itself. He turned the bronze in those hands. It was unworked. It had not yet become anything. It was only itself, which is the condition that allows anything to be made from it. He had been given his role when he was 4 years old. This is not a metaphor. The convocation of Khalkha nobles that gathered at Erdenizu Monastery in 1639 had decided, by consensus, that the boy Eshidorji, the second son of the Tushetu Khan, 4 years old, sitting in the assembly with the particular quality of attention that had already made the adults around him slightly uncertain about who exactly was observing whom, would be the supreme spiritual head of Buddhism in Mongolia. He had not been asked. He had not been old enough to be asked. The decision was made and the identity was assigned with the complete seriousness of a culture that understood this kind of recognition as discovery rather than imposition. They were not choosing him so much as acknowledging what they believed was already true. And yet, the boy grew up inside the role the way a tree grows inside the shape the wind gives it, not fighting, not choosing, simply becoming what the pressure of the world made available to become. He was given teachers. He was given ceremonies. He was given the particular discipline of a young person whose development is considered to be a matter of communal importance, which means that nothing about his formation is entirely private, that every stage of his growth is witnessed and noted and incorporated into the understanding that others are building of who he is. He was sent to Tibet at 15 to study with the 5th Dalai Lama, who recognized him formally and gave him the title and lineage that would define his place in the tradition for the rest of his life. More identity, more shape pressed from outside, by people who meant well and were not wrong. He received it with the equanimity that people develop when they have been receiving identities from outside their whole lives and have learned that receiving is not the same as becoming. He had been given the role before he had a self to refuse it with, and so the role and the self grew up together, tangled, until the only way to find one was to look very carefully at the other. The planted question was not dramatic. It was the slow question that anyone lives inside who was shaped by a role they did not choose. Is there anything in here that is actually mine? He had found the answer in his hands, not immediately, and not as a single revelation. It was the kind of discovery that happens over decades, by doing something repeatedly until you understand it from the inside. The way you learn a language, not by studying it, but by speaking it until you stop thinking about it. The life he inhabited was large and loud and full of consequence. The Khalkha Mongols were navigating the 17th century the way small nations navigate centuries in which large powers are deciding the shape of the world carefully, with as much dignity as the situation allowed, and with the constant low-level urgency of people who know the margin for error is thin. The Qing dynasty to the east was extending its administrative reach across Mongolia with the patient comprehensiveness of powers that intend to stay. The Dzungar Mongols to the west, under Galdan Bozhoktu Khan, were pressing with military force and political ambition. Zanabazar moved between these pressures as a spiritual leader, a diplomat, and a figure whose symbolic authority both parties needed to either claim or neutralize. He negotiated. He maintained the monastery. He presided over ordinations and teachings and the ceremonies that mark the passage of seasons in a community that has made its peace with the idea that the seasons will keep coming regardless of what the political situation is doing. He did all of this with genuine care and genuine competence. He was not performing the role while secretly wishing to be somewhere else. He had grown up in the role, had developed his understanding of the world through the role, and the role had given him real things, real relationships, real responsibility, real occasions to be useful. He was not ungrateful for any of this. He was simply aware, in the way that certain people are aware of things about themselves, without being able to act immediately on the awareness, that the role and the self were not the same thing, and that somewhere in the distance between them, Something was waiting to be found. He had been given the role before he had a self to refuse it with. And so the role and the self grew up together, tangled, until the only way to find one was to look very carefully at the other. The planted question was not dramatic. It was the slow question that anyone lives inside who was shaped by a role they did not choose. Is there anything in here that is actually mine? He found the answer in his hands. He began making things. Tanka paintings first, because painting was already part of the tradition's curriculum and he had been trained in it. Then scripts. He invented 2 new writing systems for the Mongolian language, because the existing scripts did not capture certain phonemes accurately, and this bothered him with the specific precision of someone who cares deeply about the accuracy of representation. This attention to the gap between what something is and what the available notation says it is would not have surprised anyone who understood what he was actually working on. Then the bronze. He moved to the bronze work in his 30s and stayed there for the rest of his life. The tent where he worked was set up wherever the traveling court happened to be, on the open steppe in summer, in more sheltered positions as the weather changed, and its internal arrangement never varied much. A workspace along the northern wall, a source of heat for the forge, the tools arranged with the logic of someone who knows where everything is without looking, who has been reaching for the same tools in the same positions for so long that the reaching has become unconscious. The smell of hot metal and the specific dusty smell of the work itself. The bronze dust that settled on everything and gave the air a particular weight. He worked in the mornings, before the day's obligations accumulated. He worked in the evenings, after they had concluded. He worked with the absorbed quality of someone who has found the activity through which the self is most directly available to itself, not performing, not demonstrating, simply present with the material and what the material was asking him to do next. But the bronze was what he kept coming back to. In the bronze, working alone or nearly alone in the specific silence of concentration, he found what the role had not given him and could not give him. The role could give him authority, responsibility, the focused attention of a people who needed what he represented. What it could not give him was the experience of being entirely himself, which turns out to require being entirely present with something that has no opinion about who you are supposed to be. The bronze had no opinion. He worked it the way the practice had taught him to work the mind, not forcing it into a predetermined shape, but sitting with it until the shape already present in the material became visible, then removing what was not that shape. This is not a metaphor about art. It is a description of a specific technical process that happens to coincide exactly with a specific contemplative process. Because the person doing both was the same person and had spent 88 years arriving at the understanding that they are the same process. His statues of Tara, of Vajradhara, of the Buddhas of the 5 directions stand now in the museums of Ulaanbaatar. And what distinguishes them from other Buddhist sculpture of the period is not technical virtuosity alone, though that is considerable. It is something harder to name. They look like what they are supposed to look like, not like what someone decided they should look like, or like what the tradition required them to look like, but like what they actually are. The figures have the quality of things that were found rather than made. As though the bronze had been waiting to be this particular thing, and Zanabazar had the patience and the stillness to listen until it told him. A student asked him once why he had not written down more of what he had understood. Other teachers left texts. The tradition valued texts. The transmission of the Dharma across generations depended on written records, on commentaries, on the careful preservation of what had been discovered so that future practitioners would not have to discover it from nothing. Why had the Jepsen Damba left so few words? The question was a real one. Zanabazar had studied and taught for decades. He had received some of the most important transmissions in the Calcutta tradition. He had understood things about the practice that few people of his era had the direct experience to understand. He had, in other words, considerable things to say. He reached across the table and picked up a small bronze figure from among the others there. It was a seated Tara, perhaps a hand's height, made decades before, with the quality that his very best work had, and that was difficult to explain to someone who had not seen it, not just skilled, but present, as though the figure was not representing stillness, but was itself the noun. He turned it in his hands for a moment. The student watched. He held it out. He said, "Everything I found, I put here. If you want to know what I learned, look at what the hands made when the mind was quiet." The student looked at the figure for a long time. He turned it, the way Zanabazar had turned it. He held it at different angles. He was trying to read it, which is the right instinct, though reading is not quite the right word for what the figure was asking him to do. Zanabazar watched him. Then he said, "Put it down. Sit with it. The understanding is not in the looking. It moves through the looking, on its way somewhere else." The student set the figure down. They sat together in the late afternoon, in the tent, on the step, with the cold outside and the smell of the forge still in the air, and the figure between them on the table, not speaking, not meditating in any formal sense, simply present. The wind pressed against the felt of the tent in the way it always did in that season. The grass outside had gone to its late autumn color and would not change again until spring. Zanabazar died in Beijing in 1723. He had gone there to conduct rituals at the Kangxi Emperor's request, and the Kangxi Emperor died shortly before he arrived. So he stayed to conduct the death rituals instead, which seems, in retrospect, like exactly the kind of thing that happens to people who have stopped requiring their lives to go the way they planned. His body was returned to Mongolia. The monastery built in his honor still stands. The bronze figures he made are still in the world. Let that settle now. You were shaped by things you did not choose: the family, the place, the time, the particular pressures of the world that was already in motion when you arrived in it. These shaped you before you had a self available to resist the shaping. This is not a wound. It is simply how beginnings work. Think of something you have made or done that no one asked you to make or do, something that came from the quiet part of you, when nothing was required, when no one was watching, when the only instruction was the thing itself. A meal you cooked with more care than the occasion required. A letter you wrote that surprised you with what came out of it. A conversation that went somewhere neither person planned. The small arrangement of objects on a shelf that pleased you in a way you could not entirely explain. That was you, not the role, not the borrowed version, but the specific person who exists in the gap between what is required and what actually comes through. What you have made with your quiet hours is what you actually are. Not all of it, but the most essential part. Let the hands be still now. Let them rest in that knowledge, which they have been carrying longer than the mind has been willing to admit. Let the breath come and go without ceremony. The step is quiet outside. The bronze is still on the table in the tent, or it is in the museum in Ulaanbaatar, or it is in both places at once, in the way that things that have been made with full attention tend to be. The shape that was always in the material has been found, and the finding does not require you to be awake to continue. The night holds it. You do not have to, and in the same night, in a different country and a different tradition, and a voice that has been with you since the beginning of this night, the same thing is true. What was made is still here. What was found cannot be unfound. End of story 4. Om Kla 109 Zana Bazar. XT. There is no new country tonight, no name to learn, no century to step inside, no figure whose life we have not already traveled through. What is here now is only what has been here all along, the same night, the same breath, the same quality of listening that has been present through every story, every voice, every life that passed through this room in the last few hours. You are still here. This is worth noticing. Not because staying awake was the goal. It was not. And if sleep came for you partway through, it came as a gift, not a failure. But something in you has been traveling tonight, even through sleep, even through the drift. Passing through Japan in the 17th century and India in the 5th century before the Common Era, and the mountain forests of China during the Yuan dynasty, and the steppes of Mongolia, and the river valleys of central Vietnam, and a hillside in Thailand, where a woman learned to sit with the particular shape of her own life. Something has been receiving all of that and is still here, still with you, still breathing. That something is not the stories. The stories are already beginning to settle. The way sounds settle after a long piece of music ends, present still in the quality of the silence that follows, but no longer individually identifiable. The monk with the lamp, who discovered the lamp was already the light. The scholar who sat all night beside his friend and found that he had no words for what needed to be said. The woman at the gate in Vasali who felt, for the first time, someone see through the arrangement to the person who had never been asked whether the arrangement was what she wanted. The man in the Tibetan ruins who set down the instrument of his mother's grief and found, in the silence where the instrument had been, the first true note of his own voice. The woman in the shop in Ratchaburi who kept a thread through 20 years of obligation and climbed a hill when the obligation was finished. The monk on the Chinese mountain who came back down and then went back up and found, the second time, that the hut he needed to rebuild was both the same hut and entirely new. The woman in the small room above the grinding shop who taught from the chair in the corner and said, "This is not something you do. It is something you stop covering up." The young monk in the temple above the Vietnamese river who carried a koan for 5 years and heard it break open, not in the sitting but in a sentence about a lamp and a meal already ready. The sculptor on the Mongolian steppe who worked the bronze the way the practice had taught him to work the mind, sitting with the material until the shape already in it became visible. They are all here now in the same way, not as separate lives but as one thing. The way tributaries become one thing once they have found the river. If a thought surfaces now, a practical thought, something from tomorrow, something that has been waiting at the edges, let it surface without landing. Let it pass across the surface of the water the way a bird passes across the surface of a lake. The lake does not follow the bird. The lake does not hold the bird's reflection after the bird has gone. The lake simply remains the lake, undisturbed, present, itself. You are the lake, the bowl. Tonight that image has traveled through 9 lives and 9 centuries and 9 corners of the world that none of these figures ever visited in their own lifetimes. And it has arrived here, in this room, at this hour, in the body you are in. The bowl cast from someone else's measure. The bowl that holds water perfectly and warmth imperfectly. The bowl that the water is always, in the end, larger than. You know something now that you knew before tonight began, but that the night has helped you locate more precisely. Not new information, new coordinates for something already present. The specific address, in the body, of the place where the borrowed life presses most firmly against the actual one. You do not have to do anything with this recognition tonight. Kihua sat in the abbot's chair for 8 years after understanding what the chair was and what he was, before he finally walked back up the mountain. Stonehouse spent 8 years being useful in the role before returning to the hut that needed to be rebuilt. The understanding does not require immediate action. It only requires that you stop pretending you do not have it. The bowl is not the vessel. You are not what you were poured into. You are the pouring. Let that move through you now, without effort, without the mind reaching to hold it before the body has had time to receive it. The body is slower and more patient than the mind. It will take what it needs. Trust it with this. The mind will have its turn. Not tonight. Tonight there is only this. The breath, which has been here through all of it, from the first image of the first story to this sentence, moving in and out with the patience of something that has no opinion about the content of what it accompanies. Just the breath. Just this movement. This is enough. This is, in fact, the thing that all 9 lives tonight were pointing toward, in different languages, from different centuries, with different hands, this breath, in this body, in this dark, being simply what it is, the specific weight of your body in the specific place where you are resting, the particular give of what holds you, mattress, chair, floor, the particular angle, the particular warmth that has been accumulating in the space between your body and whatever covers or surrounds it. These are not incidental to the night. These are the fact of you. Specific, present, entirely your own. The body that Banke nearly drove to death in search of something it had been carrying the whole time. The body that Deepa Ma learned to trust as a vessel for something vaster than grief. The body that knows, even when the mind does not, that the bowl and what fills the bowl have never been separate things. The dark has been the same dark since the first story began. Patient, without agenda, holding the room the way a good bowl holds water, not gripping, not demanding, simply being the shape that allows the thing inside to rest. Rest in it now. There is space here. More space than the day allowed. More space than the mind is accustomed to finding, which is why it sometimes rushes to fill it. Why a thought will surface even now, even in this deep quiet. A practical thought, a worry, something from tomorrow. And if it surfaces, let it surface without landing. Let it pass across the surface of the water the way a bird passes across the surface of a lake. The lake does not follow the bird. The lake simply remains the lake. You are the lake. Let the shoulders go now. Completely. Not adjusted. Not repositioned. Not moved toward a better posture. Just released to gravity, which has been waiting all night to receive them. The shoulders carry what the day requires and what the night accumulates and what the borrowed life has been pressing into them for years. That weight does not belong to the shoulders anymore. Gravity will have it. Gravity has always been very good at this. Patient. Consistent. Entirely willing to hold whatever is released to it without judgment and without effort. Let the chest open, just slightly, not forced, not performed. The small movement that happens when the shoulders release and the chest is no longer bracing against them. There is more room in the chest than the day allows. More room for the breath to arrive in. Let it arrive further. Let it go further. There is no emergency. There is no next thing. There is only the breath. finding the space that opens when the holding stops. The jaw. The jaw releases last. Long after the shoulders have surrendered to gravity and the hands have stopped holding the day and the eyes have stopped managing the dark, the jaw still carries the shape of the next word, the readiness for the next response, the trained alertness of a face that has been inhabited all day by a person who needed to be legible to other people. Let the jaw release that legibility now. Nothing is going to be said. The night requires no words from you. The night is not listening for words. It is simply here, the same way the step was simply there when Zanabazar set down his tools, the same way the mountain was simply there when Stonehouse set down his brush. The hands, let them be whatever they are. Wherever they have come to rest is the right place. They have been useful today. They have done what hands do in a life. All the small, precise, unconscious work that hands perform from the first hour to the last. The work that is so constant, it becomes invisible. Let them forget that work now. Let them rest in the specific way of hands that have set their work down and are no longer being asked for anything. The breath moves. In, out, in, slower now. The way the breath slows when the body understands that what is required of it is only to continue, not to perform the continuing. The body knows how to do this. It has always known. What has been required, all night, is only the permission. You have given it permission. It was moving before you had a word for breathing. It will move after everything that was given to you has been set down, and what remains is only what was always there, the thing that Bankei found in the warbler's song, and Vimala found in the moment of being truly seen, Liu Quan found in the sentence about the lamp that was already fire. That thing does not have a name. Every tradition in tonight's 9 stories tried to name it, and every one of them knew that the name was not the thing. The thing is what you are in right now. This breath. This dark, this particular body, in this particular room, on this particular night that is almost finished. It was moving before you had a word for breathing. It was moving before you had a concept of the self that breathes, before anyone had given you the shape you were poured into, before the first identity was pressed upon you by hands that meant well and could not help working from their own borrowed bowls. It will move after everything that was given to you has been set down, and what remains is only what was always there. The bowl was never the point. The water is the point. The living thing that takes the shape of any container but is not the container. That holds warmth when warmth is offered, and releases it when release is appropriate, and does not require the temperature to define what it is. That finds the lowest place not from weakness, but from the knowledge that the lowest place is where it is finally still. The water has been yours the whole time, before the first shape was pressed upon you, before the first name, before the first morning when you woke into a life that had already been given a shape, and you received that shape, because what else does a person do when they are small, and the shape is all there is? You were here before the bowl. You will be here when the bowl is set down. Tonight, in this room, in this body, in this breath that has been moving through all 9 lives, and now moves through yours, it has been set down. Not permanently, not as a final resolution. The morning will bring its requirements, and you will rise to meet them, and the bowl will be there. But right now, in the space between this breath and the next, it is not being held. Feel that space. It is not emptiness. It is the space that water occupies when it has been freed from the shape someone else chose for it. It is the space inside the bowl that makes the bowl useful, the part that is nothing, the part that holds everything. You are that space. You have always been that space. The breath comes, long, slow, as though arriving from somewhere very far away. The breath goes, long, slow, as though going somewhere it has been before and knows how to find in the dark. Between the coming and the going, a space. You do not have to do anything with it. It is not a problem to be solved. It is the natural pause of a thing that is alive. The moment between the in and the out, when everything is briefly, perfectly held. There is nothing left to understand. The understanding happened in the night. It happened when the warbler sang in the sealed hut and Bankei finally stopped asking the warbler what it meant. It happened when Kiwa sat beside the lamp that had burned out and found, in the dark that followed, that he still knew his own name. It happened when Vimala set down the last bracelet and remained, when Milarepa built the tower and tore it down and built it again and understood, finally, that the tower was not the point. When Ki climbed the hill with so little that the person walking alongside her asked if she had forgotten something. When Stonehouse set the brush down and let the monks carry his words back down the mountain. When Dipper Ma taught from the chair with the machines grinding below and said it is something you stop covering up. When Lu Quan said the lamp is already the fire. When Zanabaza held the bronze out and said, look at what the hands made when the mind was quiet. It is already in you. Settling now. The way water settles into earth after a long rain, not on the surface anymore, but in, and going deeper still in the dark, doing its work without your supervision, without your effort, without your needing to understand how. You do not have to stay awake for this. You do not have to hold anything. The bowl is empty. The bowl is full. The water is still. Let the breath carry you now. The way a bowl held to a river is carried, not by trying, not by steering, simply by being the shape it is, in the current that was always already moving. You are that current. You have always been that current. This is not something you need to believe. It is something the body already knows, has known all night, in the way the body knows things that the mind has not yet found words for. You do not have to find the words. The words were never the point. Go gently. Go gently into the rest of the night. Indovs 3. Vtupia of home. Cloud. Story Dijeng final. DXT. The bowl holds whatever you pour into it, but the bowl that was made to your own measure, the one that fits the specific temperature of what is actually true in you, that bowl you do not find. You become it. Slowly, over years, over a night like this one, in the silence that follows, when what was borrowed has finally been set down. Tonight, you traveled from a Japanese monastery where a boy discovered the light in the lamp was the lamp itself. Through the mountain monasteries of Korea and the ancient streets of India and the caves above the Tibetan snow line. Through a meditation hall in Rangoon and a hillside in Thailand, and a hut rebuilt twice on a Chinese mountain, and a small room above a shop where the machines had stopped for the night, and a river valley in Vietnam, and a winter steppe where a man found, in the removing of what the bronze was not, the shape it had always been. What you have been carrying tonight is not a lesson. You do not need to carry it anywhere. The understanding is already in you. It arrived while your hands were at rest, while the mind was too tired to argue with what the body already knew. You do not need to remember the names or the centuries or the specific sound of a warbler in a sealed hut. The words were the vessel. What they carried is already settling without your help. the way water settles into earth long after the rain. You do not need to carry the words. The words were never the point. You were always the point. I want to say something before this night ends. I have sat with these lives for longer than this video took to make, some of them for years. The way certain figures stay with you and show up at odd moments, changing what you thought you were looking at. I am not certain I have done them justice. I am certain they were worth the attempt. Whatever you are waking into tomorrow, you are waking into it as someone who spent a night in good company. People who faced the same question you are carrying, in different centuries and corners of the world, and found not a resolution but a way of holding it that allowed them to rest. If one face or one sentence stayed with you in a way you did not expect, I would be glad to know. You can find us wherever you are listening from. The night is almost finished. Not ended, finished. The way a piece of music finishes, with the last note still present in the room after the playing has stopped. You are that note, still sounding, not held, not forced, simply present, in the particular way of things that have found the shape that belongs to them. Rest now.